Okay, so the episode opens with a quick fourth wall breaking recap scene with the Doctor and Donna basically explaining what happened at the end of Series 4 and the 2009 specials, which I feel like this scene feels a lot like it was requested by Disney just to kind of catch everybody up, and maybe it wasn't initially in there. I do agree that we needed some sort of recap for some people, especially for people who are just watching it for the first time or haven't watched since Series 4 and can't remember exactly what happened. But I do feel like a more conventional, previously on trailer would have worked a lot better, because this does feel quite weird, especially with the Doctor just floating in space. I do think initially the idea would have probably been to have the Doctor inside the TARDIS or something, because that would have made a lot more sense. But I think they probably just chose not to do that because they didn't want to ruin the TARDIS reveal scene at the end of the episode, so instead they just kind of chose to put him floating in space, which is an interesting choice for the first impression we get of the episode, because it's literally like the first shot basically. Maybe they could have used the green screen to maybe just put in like Jodie's TARDIS or something like that. Obviously it was demolished, but like I say, he's on a green screen anyway, they probably could have put that in the background. So after that recap happens, we're then greeted to the brand new title sequence, which for the most part I quite like the new title sequence. I think the time vortex and TARDIS visuals look really good. I like how they have different cuts and it cuts to different shots of the TARDIS going through the vortex. It feels quite new and different, adds a lot of pace and energy to it, and I like the way the actors' names are revealed in this title sequence as well. However, I do have some problems with this title sequence. Number one being the music is out of sync, which is something that annoyed me way back in Capaldi's era as well, and it does make the title sequence feel way too quick as well, which some people kind of speculated this could be because it's kind of like a cut down version of Ncuti's title sequence for season 1, which I really do hope that is the case, because if this is going to be like basically the exact title sequence we also get for Ncuti's era, it's going to be a little bit annoying. But the main problem I have with this title sequence that I hope is fixed with Ncuti's title sequence as well is the kind of keyframed logo PNG for when the logo shows up at the end of the title sequence, because it just looks really bad. It's clearly just like I said, a PNG of the logo that they've just kind of added some keyframes to, or like a spin transition to, with like no motion blur or anything. And what makes this really annoying for me is we know they have like the assets and the 3D model from the logo reveal video that I feel like they could have just kind of somehow placed in here or adjusted slightly to fit with this title sequence. They do try to add a little bit of flair, making the outline of the Who kind of pop at the end, but it just would have looked a lot better if it was a 3D model like we saw in the logo reveal video, because it's kind of annoying that the logo reveal video makes the logo look better than the actual title sequence itself. So like I said, I hope that's something they change for Ncuti's titles, and that this is just because it's a cut down version of Ncuti's titles. So the first scene we properly get played out pretty much as a lot of us expected from what we saw with filming and some shots in the trailers and stuff. Feels very fast paced. I think there might have been some things cut from this, because I do remember we saw the Doctor using his heads up display and stuff like that on his sonic screwdriver during this scene in the filming. So I feel like some things might have been cut from this, and it does show because it feels very fast paced, but I also kind of don't mind how quickly we get into the action of the episode, because we basically meet Donna and Rose, and we also have the ship crashing within just a couple of minutes of the episode starting. Obviously, Donna misses the whole ship crash, which is very in character for Donna. We then also meet Sean once again, who the Doctor gets into a taxi with to go and find the crashed ship, with a nice little joke with the psychic paper referencing Jodie, and a really funny scene with the Doctor and Sean inside the taxi, which is kind of our first chance to really breathe in the episode, which is really nice. We obviously didn't spend too much time with him in the end of time, because he was more just like showing that this is who Donna's going to marry at the end of the episode. I feel like he might have had some lines in the end of time, but I can't really remember. So it's nice that we get to see a lot more of him in this, and I think he's great here. He really comes across as a character that's just kind of there along for the ride, not bothered about anything that's going on around him, which makes sense because he's with Donna, who gave away their lottery money. And speaking of the lottery money, I might as well talk about the lottery ticket as well, because I wasn't sure if this was something that was going to get brought up in the episode. If it was, I thought it would just kind of be a passing joke, but it just kind of become quite essential to the plot, as it kind of hints at Donna's memory of the Doctor and the fact that she's still got the meta-crisis in her somewhere, influencing her decisions, and shows that her character arc and character development from Series 4 hasn't been completely reset. In this episode, we also get to meet Rose Noble, Donna's daughter. There is a scene early on with Rose Noble, who is obviously trans, where she's getting called her dead name by some boys on bikes, which I personally think this was really good, as it shows trans people's lived experiences. But obviously, I'm not trans, and I've seen some trans people positive about this and some negative about this. But like I said, for me personally, I think it's good to show because it is a thing that happens to trans people. But if some people have problems with it, that's absolutely fine, and I'm obviously not the person to make that judgment. With that being said though, I do think the moment between Sylvia and Donna is really good and even better than that moment, because it shows although they make mistakes and find it difficult to remember sometimes, they still clearly love and respect Rose a lot, which is really nice. And speaking of that, Sylvia is really good in this episode. It's nice to see that she's become a lot more kind and supportive after the end of time and Journey's End, trying to distract Donna from discussions about the ship crashing because she doesn't want her to remember the Doctor in case she dies, which continues throughout the episode, pretending that she doesn't know the Doctor and she doesn't name him in case that'll make Donna remember. We then get a moment where the Doctor tries to sneak into the steelworks where the ship has landed, and he uses his sonic to draw this kind of holographic heads-up display, which I speculated would be a thing, which is a new feature of the sonic that I kind of don't mind. I think it's a pretty good feature of the sonic, and it kind of just shows the increased budget of these specials and hopefully the future seasons in this era, but I'll talk more about the sonic later on. The Doctor then meets Shirley Ann Bingham, who I think was great in this episode, and I can't wait to see her in the future. I'm pretty sure she's going to be showing up in the later specials and hopefully in Shooty seasons as well. She has a really great moment where the unit soldiers have to go up some stairs to get to the ship, where she says, "Don't make me the problem, just get in there," which is not only good commentary on her disability, but it also works for the plot as well, as it means that she doesn't get hypnotized. Following this, we get the moment where Rose finds the Meep, who's played incredibly by Miriam Margolyes, and the Meep looks great in this episode. Until I saw Doctor Who Unleashed, I thought there was a lot more CGI involved in this, but it's a lot of practical stuff for the Meep, with just a little bit of CGI on top. And once again, you can really see the budget has increased for this new era. We also have a scene where Rose corrects the Doctor on the Meep's pronouns, and the Doctor asks the Meep of the pronouns, which I think was quite well done. I think it's not as clunky as some other lines in this episode, which I will get onto later on. We're then obviously introduced to the Wrath, who are trying to capture the Meep. The first time we heard them speak, I was a little bit unsure at their voices at first, as they just kind of sounded like normal guys with not really any voice effects or anything on top of it, but I did prefer the way they spoke when we hear them in the court scene later on. Whilst they're in Donna's house looking after the Meep, we get a little scene with a reference to Wilf, which for a second I was worried that they might have cut him out of the specials because he couldn't finish filming, but luckily it was just a fake out joke. Obviously this is then followed by a huge action scene between Unit, the Wrath and Meep, where the Doctor draws some shields with his sonic, which I don't really like as much as the heads up display, but at least it takes him some time to draw them so it isn't too overpowered, and once again it just kind of shows the big budget of this special. And before that, we also get my favourite moment in the whole episode.
Something smells nice.
Tuna madras.
So our main characters escape this epic sequence in Sean's taxi, which although being shot at by the Wrath is completely fine, which at first I thought was a bit weird and convenient, but luckily this was intentional, because this, along with the unit soldiers only being stunned and not killed, was on purpose, as the Wrath weren't trying to kill anybody, just trying to retrieve the Meep as their prisoner without any casualties. So that was a nice little explanation as to what seemed like a bit of a plot hole or plot convenience. So the final act of this special is the Meep trying to escape in their ship, which would destroy London because of the way it intakes fuel, and obviously the Doctor goes onto the ship to stop the Meep, which we then get the moment where Donna leaves her family to go and help him, calling him the Doctor, which Sylvia notices and is significant as nobody has called him the Doctor all episode, as Sylvia was worried about bringing Donna's memories back and her dying. So it's a nice way of showing that Donna is starting to remember who the Doctor is, or just that in her subconscious she knows she needs to help him. So she obviously joins the Doctor on the ship, but they're then separated and the Doctor can't access all the controls that he needs to stop the Meep, and he also doesn't have enough time to tell Donna what to do on the other side, which I think was a really great excuse to have Donna's memories be brought back by the Doctor and to have the Doctor Donna back. So the Doctor brings Donna's memories back with this kind of Winter Soldier-esque code word type thing, which I thought was a nice little touch, and we find out that Donna only has 55 seconds to live, which doesn't have as big of an impact as it could have because we know she's going to be in future episodes of the specials because of the trailers, but at least they don't try and make it too big of an emotional moment when she dies, because I guess they knew that we knew this wasn't the end for her. And we get an explanation as to the reason that she doesn't die, and it's because the meta crisis that was in Donna has been shared between Donna and her daughter Rose, which I think was a really clever way of resolving that issue and explaining why she hasn't been killed by remembering who the Doctor is. However, I do personally think relating it to Rose's gender does make it a lot more complex than it needs to be, and the non-binary line relating to binary feels a little bit clunky to me, and it also doesn't really make too much sense because Rose is portrayed as being a trans woman, not non-binary in this episode, so I do feel like it was just making it a little bit too complex for what it needed to be, and I would have been perfectly happy for it to just be because Rose is Donna's daughter, so the meta crisis was inherited and split between the two of them. The other problem I have at this point in the story is Russell's reliance on what I like to call the big friendly reset button. Obviously, it makes sense that whatever they do in the ship kind of stops what the Meep is trying to do and stops the ship from taking off, but I'm not a big fan of the cracks in the ground kind of closing up and fixing themselves. I think it would have been cool to just kind of leave the cracks there, but I guess maybe that could become a problem for episodes in the future because they'd have to explain that later on down the line. And finally, another problem I had with this moment is the way the meta crisis thing is resolved, because obviously, although it was shared between Donna and Rose, they still had that meta crisis in both of them, and that's something that they kind of couldn't have continue in for the next couple of episodes, or they didn't want to continue for the next couple of episodes. But I feel like the explanation of them just letting it go felt very unsatisfying, and the explanation feels very clunky and forced, and it kind of just makes you think why Donna hasn't done this already, and the explanation as to why the Doctor hasn't thought about this before just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And yeah, like I said, letting go of the meta crisis just doesn't feel like a satisfying end to that whole arc from series 4, and just feels like a bit of a cop-out to me. However, like I said, it does mean it's something that we don't have to worry about for the next couple of episodes, and maybe Russell just didn't want that part running throughout all the specials and needed to get it wrapped up here, because it also means we don't basically have two Doctors running around for all the specials. But like I said, I feel like it was just done way too quick and not in a very satisfying way. So just before the Meep is being taken away by the Roth Warriors, they make a reference to somebody called the Boss, which sounds very vague and generic of a hint or threat, and does kind of come across as a little bit of weak writing. However, I do think it works a little bit better because of the Doctor's cryptic "I hate that" line that comes afterwards. We're then finally introduced to the brand new TARDIS interior, which I think looks great. I love the moment it's revealed as well, especially with David Tennant as the 14th Doctor running around it and doing basically a lap around the TARDIS, giddy with excitement, just like a child would be. As for the interior itself, I really love it. I think it's one of the best TARDIS interiors I've ever seen, possibly the best, but there's definitely a few things, like a few other people have said, that could improve it, like some bits of furniture and decoration here and there, which I assume we're probably going to get when Ncuti takes over the TARDIS. I'd hope so anyway, but even without that, I love it. It looks really big and expansive, and I love the fact that the lights can change to any colour and do all these different movements and stuff like that. And obviously the episode ends with a cliffhanger with Donna spilling coffee on the TARDIS, which is very in character. Overall, I think this episode was pretty good. I had a really fun time with it, and it was very fast paced and felt very large scale and big budget, which makes sense given all the Disney money. But obviously, like I said, I do have a few problems with it, specifically towards the final act and some of the explanations around the meta crisis stuff, but that doesn't mean that I didn't enjoy this episode. Okay, so a lot of people were very excited for this special and had a lot of high expectations for this episode, expecting a lot of surprise cameos and a lot more, mainly down to its secrecy in terms of the marketing, which may have been not the best decision from the team, which Russell has acknowledged himself.
I think that might have had an unfortunate effect. I think everyone's expecting Matt Smith and Peter Capaldi and the ghost of William Hartnell riding on the back of the Garm.
But personally, for me, for this episode, I just wanted something kind of weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion in there. Something a little bit like Series 4's Midnight, and luckily, that's exactly what we got for this episode. So this episode starts with a cold open with Isaac Newton under the apple tree, and I seem to be the only one who liked this cold open from what I've seen at least. I know a lot of people have complained about how pointless and unnecessary it feels, which is true, but for me personally, I honestly don't really see why that matters. It doesn't necessarily have to have much of a point to it, and it's just a bit of a fun scene that's setting up a running joke with the episode, and a nice way to kind of make you feel kind of comfortable before the episode gets really scary and weird, which I think just really adds to the impact of the scary and weird stuff in this episode.
You can appreciate the gravity of the situation.
So I love the opening of this episode proper, with the Doctor and Donna exploring the ship, and also the fact that the TARDIS leaves with the Sonic I thought was a really good touch, because it means they not only don't have the TARDIS to escape, but the Doctor also doesn't have his Sonic, which we now know is significantly upgraded from the past. I think the ship looks really great for the most part, especially the small practical rooms, the actual sets that were used in this episode, and the huge expansive CGI corridor was really cool. I've seen a few people say that this part of the ship looks pretty bad, and while I don't completely disagree, I think for the most part it looks pretty good, but there are some parts where the CGI and like the green screen of that corridor setting, such as when they're running and stuff like that, does look a little bit bad, and the keying of the green screen is a little bit too obvious, which is a shame, but like I said, for the most part I actually thought it looked pretty good. And yeah, this whole opening bit with the Doctor and Donna is very reminiscent of something like the Ark in Space from classic Doctor Who, which is one I've actually seen, where they're just trying to figure out where everyone is and what's going on, and there's a few mysteries introduced for the the episode as well, with the different words being said over the tannoy and the clanging they hear every now and then, as well as them finding out that the airlock opened and closed 3 years ago, and also the fact that Jimbo, the cute little robot, is walking one step at a time every now and then when we hear the words. So then we're introduced to the main villains of the story, which people are dubbing the Not Things, and I think the introduction of these villains was really well done. For a second, I thought we were just kind of having a little jump cut that was kind of skipping us ahead in time whilst they were finishing off this task that they were doing in separate rooms, until we then cut back and see that there's actually two versions of the Doctor and Donna in each of the rooms, and none of our characters know about it. And I think it was just really, really well done for that introduction, especially when we didn't know what the villain or the threat of this episode was going to be, which is one of the benefits of it being so secretive. And you can say what you want about what the creatures look like and some of the effects of the creatures, which I'll get to later on, but the initial line before all that happens of "my arms are too long,"
My arm's too long,
it was just so creepy, and such a creepy line to have in the show, and worked very effectively, especially the delivery of this line from both of the characters, with just how calmly and nonchalantly they say it, and the fact that they have to repeat it multiple times before our characters even click what is going on. And the concept of these creatures is a really great idea, very reminiscent of The Thing, and also quite reminiscent of that story Midnight, which I was talking about earlier on, which is what I wanted this episode to be like. And this concept also allows for some great character work and acting from Tennant and Tate in this episode. So I think the practical effects of the Not Things, such as the big long arms and the double knee and stuff like that, I think looks great. And the CGI in some points actually looks really good as well, but there were a few points with the CGI, such as the Snapchat filter or Miss Evangelista type face effects, as well as the Not Thing Doctor sticking his head out from underneath his legs, that I personally thought didn't look the best. And like I said earlier as well, some of the moments where they're running down the corridor, the CGI looks pretty bad as well, or is at least a bit noticeable where it shouldn't be. There's a few moments in here as well where the Doctor and Donna obviously inevitably get separated and don't know whether they're talking to their Not Thing self or the real self. And one of these situations we get a little reference to the Timeless Children and the Flux. We finally have acknowledgement that the Flux has destroyed half the universe and that it hasn't been fixed or reset, which is something that Chibnall didn't even bother to do in his own era, which was something that really annoyed me about the Flux. And we also get to see more emotion from the Doctor and more of a reaction from the Doctor about the Timeless Children stuff than we also got in Chibnall's era, which isn't like Jodie's fault or anything. It's more Chibnall not writing a scene like this for Jodie in that era, which I think was a really missed opportunity, so I'm glad that we got that in this. So then we find out that the Not Things basically learn things from the characters the faster they do stuff, and that's the reason they're trying to scare them, to get their adrenaline pumping and to get them thinking so that they can copy them even faster and even better, which leads to this great moment where the Doctor, wanting to solve all these mysteries, is told that he needs to stop thinking so that the Not Things can't evolve and become more like them. But obviously he just really wants to think and try and solve all these mysteries that have been set up earlier on in the episode, which he eventually ends up doing. And so that reveals these few mysteries that we had at the start of the episode, with the clanging being the captain floating in space,
Rehab was supposed to be a fresh start,
which also explains the airlock being opened and closed 3 years ago. We find out the words are actually a countdown, they're actually the numbers of the language that these aliens spoke, which I think was really well done because the Doctor initially shrugs off the possibility of a countdown early on. And we also find out the reason that Jimbo, the robot, was walking so slowly was because it was slowly walking towards this self-destruct button that the captain had set up and made to go slowly so that the Not Things couldn't figure out what was going on. And the conclusion to this story, initially I was a little bit confused, and it did feel a little bit like a Deus Ex Machina of sorts, but it does actually kind of make sense when you think about it and kind of realize what it means and what's actually going on, because the TARDIS would obviously know if the Not Things aren't going to be able to reach Jimbo in time to stop the countdown, which is what is about to happen. The TARDIS would obviously realize that and be able to show up early enough to pick up the Doctor and Donna. But obviously then the Doctor picks up the wrong Donna in a great moment where he asks them the question that was set up earlier on about Mrs. Bean, asking them the question why that name is funny, and he ends up taking the Donna that says because it just is, because he obviously thinks that's more like what Donna would say, but this ends up actually being the wrong Donna, which I think is great because it kind of shows that although that would make sense and that is what I was thinking in my head, I was like, yeah, that would be the right Donna. It shows that maybe that would have been initially what the real Donna was thinking, but she probably thought that wasn't a good enough answer for the Doctor and probably overthought the question a little bit, which ultimately led to her not being taken by the Doctor and the Doctor not believing that she was the real one, which led to a great showcase of Catherine Tate's acting ability in this episode when she's shouting for the Doctor to come back because he's taken taken the wrong one. And then we get another fake out death with Catherine Tate, although this one works significantly better than the fake out death in the Star Beast, because they almost didn't play that one in the Star Beast seriously and give it enough weight to make it feel real. Maybe because they knew that we knew she was going to be in future episodes. But in here, they really play it as if it is actually about to happen. And even though we know she's going to be in the Giggle, for a second, I still genuinely thought she might die here and maybe be replaced by her Not-Thing counterpart or something like that. And I was genuinely on the edge of my seat from what I remember. Like, I was literally on the edge of my seat. But obviously, the Doctor then realizes in the TARDIS, I think by scanning the Not-Thing Donna, that she is in fact the Not-Thing Donna, not the real Donna, which I do feel like was a little bit unsatisfying, a way of him realizing that that wasn't the real Donna, because it isn't actually about him kind of figuring it out himself. He just kind of scans her on the TARDIS and realizes that one of her arms is too long or something like that. So I think that could have been done slightly better. But obviously, after doing this, the real Donna is then reunited with the Doctor in the TARDIS, and they go back home, but they're maybe a day or two late, according to the Doctor, which leads them to arriving exactly where they just left, but this time, Wilfred Mott is there to greet them. And for those who don't know, Wilf is probably my favourite character in all of Doctor Who, and so I was so happy to see him. I knew he was going to be in this. I just didn't know exactly when we were going to see him, but I'm so glad we finally did. Even if this is going to be his only appearance in the specials, which has been alluded to, the fact that this is the scene that they managed to film with him is just so great, because it was such a great scene and such a great moment between him and the Doctor and Donna, and the perfect scene for his reappearance in the show, because now we finally at least know that he knows Donna remembers these things now. He can talk to Donna about it, and he finally gets to see the Doctor in the same face that he remembers once again. Like I said, I think it was the perfect scene to have of him in this special, and I'm just so grateful that we actually got to have this scene and this moment in these specials. And it's just great to see Wilf and Bernard Cribbins again, obviously. And then this leads to a great cliffhanger to the next episode, The Giggle, where we just kind of see everyone going crazy, which, you know, doesn't give too much away and just perfectly sets everything up. Really feels like there's high stakes going into this next episode straight from the get-go, and I just can't wait to see where this leads us to. So, like I said at the start of this video, although we were expecting a little bit more from this episode, or at least some people were, all I personally wanted from this was something weird and mind-bending and scary, with some good character work and emotion, and like I said, something a little bit like Midnight from Series 4. And obviously, like I said, that's exactly what we got, and I loved it. The character work in this was great, whether that be between the Doctor and Donna, or them and their Not-Thing counterparts. I do think this episode works a lot better on the page. It's perfect on the page, and it works almost perfectly in the execution, because like I said, the practical effects look great, but obviously some of the CGI was a little bit ropey in there, but for me it still kind of works just because of how weird it was. So I thought the Toymaker was really good in this episode. I haven't seen the original story, and obviously a lot of it is missing, so I don't really know what he's meant to be like, but I do know that original story isn't meant to be that good anyway from what I've heard. But I did think the Toymaker was really good in this. Probably the only complaint I really have is I do feel like he should have dropped that German accent a little bit sooner than he did, or been speaking mostly in that British accent for most of the time, because it did start to get a little bit annoying after a bit, and I thought he was going to drop the accent when the Doctor immediately recognises him, or first recognises him in the toy shop, which he doesn't, but I do feel like that would have been a lot better if he had done that. I know the accent is meant to be purposefully bad, but it still gets a little bit annoying throughout the episode. I think the Toymaker's realm was really well visualized in this story. Obviously, it's not something they could have really done this well in the 60s, and so the visuals of that endless corridor and the black void that they're in, I think was visualized really well, and a nice updated version of the Toymaker's realm. And I also liked the companion puppet show that the Toymaker put on for the Doctor and Donna, to show Donna what had happened with the Doctor's companions since she left. I've seen a lot of people complaining about this, saying there's no mention of Chibnall era companions, but to me that's really obvious that it's because those characters didn't die like the characters the Toymaker is talking about. Obviously I know those characters didn't actually die, and that's what the Doctor is saying, but that's obviously the reason these companions were chosen. And there is still a mention to Flux in there, so it's not like Chibnall Erasure or something like that. And I obviously really liked the creepy puppet scenes, especially the one with the Doctor, with the puppet of the guy we see in the cold open, and the puppet of himself. But obviously also I really liked the creepy scene between Donna and Stooky Sue and the Stooky babies, which I think was really creepy as well. But personally I think the bits with the Doctor in that moment worked a lot better. And obviously, whilst we're still on the topic of the Toymaker, I really liked the Spice Up Your Life scene. It was really creepy, especially with David Tennant playing it straight as the Doctor when those unit soldiers die. It just really shows how crazy the Toymaker is, because he's just having so much fun with this when people are dying. In terms of the actual Giggle plot that is throughout this episode, the thing that this episode is named after, I think it was really well set up with the post-titles scene, and even the cold open with John Logie Baird, who I thought was going going to feature a little bit more in this episode than he did, but I'll get onto that later. But yeah, the Giggle plot was really well set up with the scene after the title sequence where we see the effect it's having on the general population of Earth, and it was also really well set up with the scenes at Unit in the first half, with some great commentary on society and the government, and obviously the anti-vax allegory with Trinity Wells, which I think was really well done. But the problem I have with the Giggle plot is that it seems to basically take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Donna travel back to 1925 and confront the Toymaker, and from that point on it just feels a little bit disconnected from the rest of the plot, and I think it's really unfortunate that we don't get to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that post-title scene that I talked about earlier. And I think for that reason this episode could have benefited a little bit from being either 2 parts, or what I personally think would have been better is if it was a 90-minute episode like The Power of the Doctor, because that would have just given us more time to see the effect it has on humanity outside of that one scene at the start of the episode. Obviously, Unit are in this episode, and they have the brand new Unit HQ, which looks a bit like Stark Tower or Avengers Tower, which I think looked really good. And they also have the Vlinx, which is a robot-type alien creature in there, which isn't really explained as to why he's there. But for me personally, what I think that is they're just trying to fill out the Unit roster for a potential spin-off in the future, similar to Mr. Smith in Sarah Jane Adventures. And speaking of Unit, it's great to see some of the returning characters. Obviously, we get to see Kate Stewart in this episode, who gets a really good moment when she takes the Z-Dex off, or deactivates her Z-Dex to show the effects of the Giggle, and it's just really nice to see her written by RTD, and I can't wait to see her return in the future with Ncuti Gatwa. This also leads to a nice moment with Shirley, which shuts down the complaints of the bigots that they had in the Star Beast, who basically just don't understand that disability is a spectrum, and were basically accusing Ruth Madeley of not being disabled, which is just insane. So I'm glad that that was in there. It's almost like Russell predicted that that was going to happen, those complaints were going to be made by bigots, and so that moment just works really well for that. And we also get a nice moment with Mel when she first sees the Doctor again, and the Doctor first recognizes her after almost not noticing her immediately, which I think was a really good way of doing it. But unfortunately, although these characters have these nice moments at the start, they don't actually end up doing a whole lot in the episode, because they kind of get sidelined for the second half. Because like I alluded to earlier, once the Doctor and Donna go back to 1925 to confront the Toymaker, the whole Giggle plot kind of takes a back seat from the rest of the plot, and these characters' appearances kind of suffer with that as well, which I think is really unfortunate. But like I said, I enjoyed the moments we got with them in this episode, and I think they were really good. I just wish we would have been able to see more of them, and that as well could have been a benefit of having this episode be 90 minutes long or a 2-parter or something like that. Okay, so obviously this is the last episode of these specials with the 14th Doctor, at least as the main Doctor in the show. So he obviously regenerates in this episode. And for me personally, I quite liked this regeneration. I really liked how sudden the regeneration was. The Doctor was basically like mid-sentence when he gets shot by the galvanic beam by the Toymaker, which I think was really good and felt kind of shocking and sudden, especially with how much left of the episode we had. Obviously with 10's regeneration, back in the End of Time Part 2, it ended with him alone in the TARDIS saying, "I don't want to go," which is quite a controversial line, which at the time I liked, but the more I think about that line, the more I realise it's a little bit unfair on the next Doctor, which at the time was Matt Smith, so it isn't my favourite final line of a Doctor. But with 14's regeneration, who is obviously also David Tennant, he regenerates surrounded by friends like Donna and Mel, who are right by his side, which I think was really nice. And instead of saying "I don't want to go," he says "it's time" and "allons-y," which obviously means "let's go" in French. So I just really liked that contrast of the 14th Doctor and the 10th Doctor's final lines, which was something I was really hoping for in this episode. And as well as that, we also got some nice references to previous classic regenerations in this moment as well, with the Doctor saying "here we go again," which is a reference to the 3rd Doctor's regeneration, and him saying "it feels different this time" just before the bi-generation, which is a nice reference to the 5th Doctor's regeneration in Caves of Androzani. Now we're getting on to the bit that you're probably all here for, the bi-generation in this episode, a brand new addition to Doctor Who canon basically, in terms of Time Lord regeneration mechanics and stuff like that. Now I had seen the leak before this episode, unfortunately, although I had only read it once and I didn't read it again like really close to the episode or anything, so I didn't remember the exact details, but I had read the leak. And while I didn't like the idea on paper of the leak, I do feel like the execution of this concept and this bi-generation was a lot better than I expected it to be from reading the leak itself. It allows us to have a multi-Doctor story for the 60th anniversary specials in a way that we've not seen before, with a future Doctor meeting our current Doctor instead of a past Doctor, which I think was a really interesting thing to do. And seeing David Tennant and Ncuti Gatwa on screen together was really good, and I think they had really good chemistry. And I also seem to be the only person that liked the catch scene in this episode. I just thought it was a really fun conclusion to the episode and a really fun way to beat the Toymaker. And a lot of people seem to be complaining about this idea, being confused as to why the Toymaker isn't able to just catch a ball because of how powerful he is. But this is explained earlier on in the episode with the fact that the Toymaker doesn't cheat. That's the one thing he basically doesn't do. He plays by the rules.
The only rules the Toymaker follows are the rules of the game. They bind his entire existence.
But with that being said, I really don't like this line.
Do you come in a range of colours?
I also like the scene with the 14th Doctor having a meal with Donna and her family at the end of the episode. I think it was a really well executed and emotional scene, and David Tennant was just great in that moment. And overall, this bi-generation idea, this concept, was a nice and interesting way of concluding this era and passing the torch to not only Ncuti Gatwa, but just to a brand new era of the show in general. However, although I thought the bi-generation thing as a whole was really well executed, I still don't know how I feel about the concept in the first place. Obviously, this means that the 14th Doctor is still around, which I'm not sure how I feel about. It feels very similar to the end of Journey's End, with the Metacrisis Doctor going to live his life with Rose in the parallel universe, and it just really makes it seem like RTD really wants to just keep his favourite Doctor around as much as possible. And I really think the 14th Doctor shouldn't have kept his own TARDIS at the end of the episode, because that just invites him to return in the future and also makes him equal to the 15th Doctor, which just slightly undermines the 15th Doctor a little bit in my eyes. And I really hope and don't think that this is setting up a 14 and Donna spin-off, as it would just be too similar to the main show, and some people would just kind of be treating this as like, this is real Doctor Who, and Ncuti Gatwa isn't real Doctor Who, and I just don't think that would be fair. But I do think that maybe 14 and Donna will appear often in maybe like the unit spin-off that they seem to be setting up with the Vlinks. I just hope they don't get a spin-off of their own, because I don't think that would be fair. And to add on to that, I just think the optics of this, from a conceptual standpoint, just isn't great, because it just kind of gives ammunition for certain people to say that Ncuti Gatwa isn't the real Doctor, and the real Doctor is still out there somewhere in the 14th Doctor, which I just think is a little bit unfair on Ncuti Gatwa, and it's not great optics for the first black main Doctor. But talking about Ncuti Gatwa, I think he was really good in this episode. Right from the outset, I really enjoyed him, and they do try to give him as many of the Doctor's lines as possible once he's introduced in this episode, although he does still feel somewhat overshadowed by David Tennant being there, especially with this being the 14th Doctor's story, and they still need to conclude the 14th Doctor's story in this episode. But I can't wait to see him as the full-time Doctor at Christmas and next year in season 1 or series 14 or whatever we're calling it. And obviously also at the end of the episode we get a little hint to the Master returning, with the fingers picking up the golden tooth that the Master is supposedly trapped in, which I personally think this was just meant to be a bit of a jokey moment from RTD, a nice little reference back to series 3 where this also happened, and I don't think there's any immediate plans to bring back the character anytime soon, or at least I hope not, because I think the Master needs a break for a little bit before they bring him back, and I really hope Anya and Barnard is not playing him in season 1, because that seems like that concept will just be too similar to the whole Saxon arc in series 3. So overall, I really enjoyed this episode for the most part. I'm still not 100% sure how I feel about the bi-generation, just as a concept to begin with in this episode. Although, like I said, I do feel like it was really well executed in this episode. And the more I think about this episode, the more I like it, which is basically the opposite of how I feel about the Star Beast. Basically, the Star Beast, for the most part, I liked as an episode, but the more I think about the ending of that episode, the more I dislike it. While Blue Yonder, I've been pretty solid on, like, I love that episode. There's a few dodgy VFX in there, but for the most part, I think it's really good. And this episode I really enjoyed, and the more I think about it, the more I like it. So that's kind of how I feel overall about the specials. For that reason, I think I'd put the Star Beast at probably a low B tier, possibly even C tier. I'd easily put Wild Blue Yonder at A ranking, and I think I'd put the Giggle at a high B on the tier list. Okay, so the first time I watched The Church on Ruby Road, I wasn't quite sure how I felt about it, possibly because I was watching it with family and couldn't give it my full attention. I didn't love it, nor did I hate it, but I was leaning more towards not liking it after the first viewing. But after rewatching it a couple days later, I liked it a lot more. Obviously, the main thing about this episode is Ncuti Gatwa as the 15th Doctor.
I'm the Doctor.
Who I really liked in the role straight away. He feels like the Doctor immediately and is really likable, and I liked how much more emotionally open this Doctor is, especially in comparison to the 13th Doctor, who was quite emotionally closed off. However, I don't feel like Ncuti has had his Doctor moment yet. It comes close with the scene that was requested by Disney, where he's talking to that police officer.
If you don't mind, I just got snowman, and I would like to go home.
But I still don't feel like he's had his proper Doctor moment yet. But I'm sure he'll get that somewhere in season 1, probably in the first episode. Speaking of the Disney requested scene, I'm not sure how I felt about this scene, because although I really liked it and I thought Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor was great in it, I do feel like it would have had much more of an impact if we didn't see the Doctor properly until he first properly introduces himself to Ruby on the ladder, as was originally intended. But like I said, I did really like him in that scene, so I'm a little bit conflicted there. As for the other brand new main character we got in this episode, Ruby Sunday, I really liked her as as well. This is more of Ruby's episode than the Doctor's episode, which makes sense as it's meant to be similar to episodes like Rose, where we follow the story through the companion's point of view and are introduced to them before we're introduced to the Doctor. I also really like Ruby's family. I'm glad RTD is bringing back the domestic aspects of the show that he did so well in his first era, and having a companion's family that we can relate to and get to know over time. I think her relationship with Carla is great, and I love how close they are, especially when we see what Carla's life would be like without Ruby towards the end of the episode.
Why would I want a daughter when I'm happy as I am?
Then why are you crying?
And also, of course, Ruby's grandmother, Cherry. I think she was the best character in the whole episode. She was absolutely hilarious, and I can't wait to see her in future episodes. I've said this before in another video, but I seem to be the only person who actually likes the new sonic screwdriver design. It's a nice, refreshing design, and anyone who's complaining about it not looking like a screwdriver, as if the past few Sonics really looked anything like a screwdriver either, are coping really hard. The intelligent gloves, not psychic gloves, as Shooty said, were a cool addition to the episode. Their introduction in the story, both when they're on the ladder and when they escape the Goblin's ship, is a really clever and organic way to set up the conclusion to this story.
Hiya.
Obviously, in this episode as well, we have the Goblins and the Goblin King, which I think were a very interesting and unique addition to the show, helped by the Toymaker paving the way for more supernatural villains like this. And for that reason, I liked how they worked differently to anything we've seen before. It allows for the Doctor to have some fun moments of excitement and joy as he figures out how their technology works. Obviously, we also have the Goblin song in this episode. I had heard the Goblin song before the episode aired, and honestly was dreading watching that moment with my family.
He's the Goblin King, yes, the Goblin King. He's not a myth, he's an actual thing.
And at the time of watching it on Christmas Day, I did feel quite embarrassed and didn't like it on first viewing. But I think this is mostly just because I was watching it with other people and feeling embarrassed. But after rewatching the episode, I think the Goblin song fits very well with the rest of the episode. And I even like when the Doctor and Ruby join in with the singing. However, I do think this moment would have worked a lot better if we didn't already know the song was going to be in the episode and didn't get to hear the song beforehand. The main problem I have with the Goblins and the Goblin King in this episode is they do take a bit of a backseat once the Doctor and Ruby escape the Goblin ship. We do now know from the commentary that there was meant to be a scene where the Doctor and Ruby fight off the Goblins and the Goblin King in Ruby's flat, but this was cut for budgetary reasons, so that could explain why it does feel a bit weird and feel like they're missing for quite a lot of the episode. And it just kind of makes them feel a little bit absent from the episode and almost like they're just working in the background. With that being said though, I really liked the moments in the flat between the Doctor, Ruby and Carla, so I can't really complain because it just means we got more of that, but it does affect the pacing a little bit with how long we don't see the Goblins for, and just know that they're up there somewhere until we get to see them again at the end. Speaking of the end, the final act at the church, like I said earlier on, I liked how well and seamlessly the intelligent gloves were set up earlier on in the episode. It makes the payoff of this moment a lot more effective and climactic, and it doesn't feel like it comes out of nowhere, and like I said, it just feels like a payoff. However, I do feel like it feels somewhat out of character for the Doctor to just Simon Skinner that Goblin without at least trying to negotiate with them or something first. But with that being said, they do eat babies and tried to abduct Ruby and eat her as a baby, so maybe it's somewhat justified. It also feels a bit weird that the Goblin ship just disappears, and I wasn't sure how I felt about that on my first viewing. But then again, the Goblins are a new supernatural monster that we haven't previously had in the show and are only here thanks to the Toymaker. It does also feel weird that the Doctor doesn't follow the woman who abandoned Ruby at the church, but to be honest, this moment is something we'll likely return to at some point in season 1, as it's probably a big part of the overarching storyline. Also, I haven't yet talked about Davina McCall in this episode. I think she was a fun guest star to have in a Christmas special, but honestly, her acting's not the best, which is fair enough because she is a presenter by trade. I think her death in this episode was a good way to show how much of a threat the Goblins can be, and that they're not just slightly mischievous and eating babies. In a normal episode, I probably wouldn't really like the moment where the Doctor goes back to save her from the Christmas tree at the end, but because this is a Christmas special, I think it works just fine. However, I am a bit unsure of how the Doctor knew about what happened to Davina in the first place. I guess we just have to assume that Ruby told him when they were tied up or something like that, or when they were going up the ladder. Maybe there's a deleted scene for that somewhere or something. And obviously, finally, this episode ends with Mrs. Flood breaking the fourth wall directly to the camera about asking if you've never seen a TARDIS before.
Never seen a TARDIS before.
Which I did feel like was a little bit weird and out of place, but I guess we'll just have to see what her character turns out to be in the future. Maybe this is just something she does and we don't quite know who she is yet, but even with that being said, it did feel a little bit weird and out of place. Okay, so this episode opens immediately after the Church on Ruby Road with some of the same shots and some new refilmed moments of what we'd already seen at the very end of that episode, kicking off right where we left off with Ruby's first adventure, which the Doctor sets to a random landing, taking them to the dinosaurs, where we get a fun butterfly effect moment which we basically saw in the trailers. Now this is a pretty fun scene overall, but it doesn't add too much to the episode, and it does feel a little bit disconnected, but I do think this is possibly a Disney edition, and it's not really a bad scene. It is kind of useful to kind of show the time traveling capabilities of the TARDIS and introduce it to new audiences on Disney Plus and any other new audiences that are watching. So like I said, this isn't like a bad scene or anything. It's a fairly fun scene, but for me personally, it doesn't add too much to the episode, and I do feel like it could have been a Disney Plus edition. And I think Ruby and the Doctor's chemistry in this episode is absolutely amazing, as can be said for the next episode as well. One of the standout moments of this in this episode is the Doctor's reaction to Ruby giving the 5 digits for the year when he's probably expecting just a 4-digit year. Now there's also a lot of exposition in this episode, which is expected. This is the start of a new era, and it's introducing the show to a new audience, particularly those on Disney Plus. So I get why it's in here, but there is quite a lot of it in this episode. Now it does mostly feel natural. A lot of it is motivated by Ruby asking the Doctor questions. However, some of the exposition in this episode that the Doctor gives does sometimes feel a little bit unmotivated and unprompted, with the Doctor just randomly telling Ruby things that she hasn't asked about. But like I said, it does kind of make sense because they need to introduce these things to a new audience, but some of it could have been done a little bit more naturally, and some of it was. We also get a hint at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with a chilling scene of the Doctor and Ruby's memory of the Church on Ruby Road bleeding through into reality, with the snow coming through into the spaceship, which like I said was just a really chilling scene and a really good way at hinting at the story arc that we're going to get in the future. But I'll talk more about Ruby's story arc in my review for The Devil's Chord. So obviously in this episode we have the titular space babies, which is a very silly concept but quite a fun idea. It's definitely an odd choice for the opening episode of the season, unless you count the Church on Ruby Road as the opening episode. But then again, we did have Partners in Crime, which had Living Fat in that episode, so it's not too far off a standard RTD opener. This also allows for us to finally get a Doctor moment for Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor, where he's talking to Captain Poppy, explaining to them that they haven't grown up wrong and that nobody grows up wrong, which I think is a really nice message for this episode, and like I said, a very Doctor-y moment, which I'm glad we finally got to see from the 15th Doctor, and it obviously sets up the ending of this episode quite nicely. I've seen a lot of people complaining about the CGI of the talking babies, which, while it doesn't look the best, such as the reactions on their faces not suiting the dialogue, I think the effect is done as well as it could have been. So I don't really know what people would have wanted besides them maybe talking telepathically or something along those lines, but for me personally, I don't think it looks too bad for as well as it could have been done, basically. For me personally, it wasn't too distracting, but it definitely helps that the babies take a bit of a backseat after we're introduced to Jocelyn. And talking about the space babies, the Doctor does say space babies maybe one too many times, and it did start to get a little bit annoying. We're also introduced to the character of Jocelyn, or Nan-E, who was a very fun character. I really liked the introduction of this character, at first thinking that she was just an AI, for her then to get annoyed at the Doctor and break character, telling him to hurry up. And on those same lines, the Nan-E filter allows for a lot of fun comedic moments with censoring of expletives throughout this episode as a kind of running joke. The character of Jocelyn also allows for a really nice emotional moment in this episode, where she explains why she's been hiding away from the babies, as she doesn't want to see them die or for them to see her die as well. There's also some really good political commentary in this episode, with a focus on reproductive rights, with the babies being forced to be born but there being no obligation or assistance to look after them, with Ruby making a comment that it's not unlike our world, which definitely feels like a bit of a jab at the US right now. As well as this, there's also the political commentary on refugees, with the planet that accepts refugees not coming to collect them, as you physically have to show up there. However, although I do think this political commentary is good, that is basically the extent of the political commentary in this episode. It's just a couple of lines that aren't really elaborated on throughout the rest of the episode, so they maybe could have gone a little bit further there, but I do think it was still done really well and was definitely some good moments for this episode. We obviously also have the Bogeyman in this episode, which I think was a very fun, fairly standard Doctor Who monster that works really well for an opening episode. I think the hints at where it came from are very clever in this episode, not giving it away too quickly, although I had seen people speculating that the monster would have been made out of bogies before the episode had aired, so I kind of figured it out a little bit early on. But I particularly like the Doctor being confused as to why he ran away, for it to be revealed that it's because it was created with the intention of it being scary for the babies. I really liked the comedy especially in the reveal of the bogeyman being made out of bogies. Once again, the Doctor and Ruby's chemistry is just great in this episode, and that's a great showcase of that. And obviously, this episode ends with the Doctor saving the bogeyman, which is very characteristic of the Doctor, and it does make sense with it being the only one of its kind as set up earlier on in the episode. However, it does still feel a bit weird as it's made to be the antagonist of the episode. Obviously, it's technically fine, as I assume the bogeyman was never actually going to kill the babies, as it was only designed to scare them, not kill them. But I do feel like there could have been more of an attempt to get the audience to empathise with it after the reveal, as it still feels a bit weird that the Doctor wants to save it, even if it does make sense character-wise. Maybe there could have been a line hinting at the fact that it was weird that the bogeyman didn't kill Eric when it easily could have done, or something along those lines, just to prove that it was only designed to scare them and not kill them. Because I can imagine a lot of the audience were left thinking that now they've left the bogeyman alive, it's just going to kill the babies, which I'm pretty sure isn't the intention. Overall, I think this was a perfectly fine opening episode, if not a bit sillier than usual. It establishes the Doctor and Ruby's relationship and dynamic really well, and it also establishes the concepts of the show to new viewers in a pretty natural and organic way for the most part. Although, like I said, there are some unmotivated moments of exposition in this episode. And there's also some nice hints at the further story arcs of the season in there as well. Compared to previous RTD openers, I think it's actually very similar. In my opinion, his opening episodes usually aren't the best in terms of their plot, and this episode is exactly the same. His opening episodes are usually more about the characters and introducing the audience than they are about the actual plot of the episode, so I think this one is fairly standard in terms of RTD openers, if not a bit sillier than some of his previous ones. When it comes to opening episodes in Doctor Who, I think the Moffat era did a much better job at openers, so like I said, in my opinion, Space Babies is actually a fairly standard RTD opener. Like I said, I liked this episode for the most part, but overall it was just okay. It's definitely the weaker out of the two first episodes of this season, which obviously I'll get into more next week when I review The Devil's Chord. I think if I was to put this episode on a tier list, I'd probably rank it at C, maybe B tier at a push, but for now I think I'm going to leave it at C, and maybe I'll change it up later on when we get to see the rest of the episode. Okay, so this episode opens with a very classic Russell T Davies cold open, introducing us to the main villain of the episode, Maestro, who I think is a great villain, portrayed incredibly by Jinx Monsoon, who I just think did an incredible job in this episode. I know for some people the performance is a little bit over the top, but for me personally, I think it works perfectly for this episode. Although Jinx Monsoon has recently come out as trans, the character of Maestro is stated to be non-binary in the cold open of this episode. Now, let me know if I'm speaking out of turn here, but I think the non-binary nature of this character really works in their favour, as after all they are a godlike entity, being the child of the toy maker. So them being non-binary I think really works to show how powerful and out of this world this character is, if that makes sense. They're a sort of nebulous entity, so I think making them non-binary and giving them that non-binary identity really helps to reinforce that. And like I just mentioned, Maestro is confirmed to be a child of the toy maker and part of the pantheon and a god of chaos, which I think is a really clever way of setting the stakes of this villain, and a really easy way to relay to the audience how powerful of a force they are, as anybody who's seen the 60th anniversary specials, and particularly the Giggle, knows just how powerful this character should be if they are a child of the toy maker. And this also really helps to reinforce the Doctor's fear when he figures out who Maestro is and that they're related to the toy maker with the Giggle early on in the episode. Okay, so the first scene we get after the cold open and the title sequence is with the Doctor and Ruby, and this is one of my favourite scenes we've had of them so far. Once again, their dynamic is on full display, with the Doctor pretending he doesn't like Ruby's suggestion of going to see the Beatles to actually trick her and show how happy he is that she said that. I also love the moment and the shot we get of them changing into their 1960s outfits, even though it is a bit weird that Ruby is already in an outfit that wouldn't seem out of place in the first place, but like I said, it allows for us to have that really nice moment and that great shot of them changing into their outfits, which I think is one of the best directed shots we've had in the season so far. Now, the weird thing about this episode is there is a 6-month time jump for some reason, which I think was a very odd mention in the script, and for me personally it's not really a good decision for the second episode of the season. I've seen some people mention that this might have been done to have a gap for Big Finish and other expanded media, which is fine, but if so, I feel like it should have been done later on in the season than it was here, because we're just getting used to the characters and we really want to see their relationship develop in these early episodes. So I think having a 6-month time jump in between episodes episode 1 and 2 was a pretty big mistake in my opinion. I've seen some people speculate that this episode was originally intended to be later in the season, which I think is definitely likely. However, Ruby suggesting to go and see the Beatles early on in this episode sounds like it would have been her first request after their first adventure in Space Babies, and my personal theory for how this episode was going to start is that it was going to take place immediately after the first episode, with this adventure being Ruby's first suggestion after their first adventure, which would also have justified the 2-episode premiere, as these episodes could have taken place immediately after each other, which would have made a lot more sense in my opinion. And I'm personally surprised they didn't just ADR the scene where June or July of 2024 is mentioned instead of Christmas, because I'm pretty sure the Doctor is both far away enough and maybe even facing away from the camera that I think an overdubbed line in the scene would have worked pretty seamlessly. We also get mentions of the Doctor's granddaughter Susan in this episode, which I believe is the first time she's been properly mentioned by name in all of the New Era, although I guess this is technically another New Era anyway. Now, most of the exposition so far has been something that is important for the new audience to know and catch them up to speed, which this isn't, so it does feel like this is something that wouldn't be mentioned unless it's going to be brought up again later on in the season. And we do know that Susan Twist is playing a character called Susan Triad in the finale, so it's possible that there's a connection there, and maybe we're going to see Susan later on in the season, or Susan's going to be Susan Triad or related to Susan Triad or something along those lines. But let me know what you think about that in the comments below. We also have some more hints at Ruby's story arc in this episode, with more memories bleeding through into reality like in the previous episode, and Maestro mentions a character called the Oldest One who was apparently present during Ruby's birth. I know some people have been speculating recently that this could be the Trickster. I'm not sure how likely that is, but let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And Maestro once again reminds us that the one who waits is coming, which some people have speculated could be Sutek, which I'd love if that was true, but I don't know how likely that is. Again, let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. But this could be more evidence that this episode was meant to air later in the season, possibly right before the finale, as I'm pretty sure Maestro says the one who waits is closer than we think, so you'd think that'd be a bit later on in the season. Obviously, this episode sees the Doctor and Ruby going to see the Beatles record their first album, only for them to see that the Beatles, Cilla Black, and this orchestra are all playing terrible music, which I think makes for one of the best moments in this whole episode. I love both of their reactions to all of the musicians playing terrible music. I think it's a hilarious moment of the episode, and I think the Ruby and Doctor's reactions are perfect. Although the quote-unquote bad music that the Beatles are playing honestly isn't too far off something the Beatles would have made. Think I Am the Walrus or Octopus's Garden, but it's still a hilarious moment nonetheless. Speaking of the Beatles, I knew they weren't going to feature heavily in this episode. My prediction was that they would be trapped in their instruments most of the episode, and so I don't really mind that much that they don't look a whole lot like the Beatles. However, I do think it is really unfortunate that George and Ringo are pretty much sidelined for this episode, with us only focusing on John and Paul. But with that being said, I do really like the conclusion to the threat being those two coming together to play the chord that banishes Maestro. And of course, this episode ends with a final big musical number. Now, for me personally, I'm not the biggest fan of musicals, but I was expecting a musical number in this episode and was personally quite excited for it because I wanted to see how they'd do it, and it's something new for Doctor Who. However, the musical number at the end of this episode just didn't work for me. It didn't feel justified in the plot at all for me and just felt ultimately a bit tacked on, and the song itself just also isn't very good. It's nearly as bad as the made up bad songs earlier on in the episode. I've seen some people suggest that it should have been used to defeat Maestro in the music battle instead, which, although being more justified in the plot, I personally wouldn't have preferred that, as I think the music battle sequence is perfect as it is, besides that one cringy music battle line. It also doesn't really make sense in the plot, as Maestro has already been defeated, so we're kind of left questioning why this is happening in the first place. I think the intention was meant to be that Maestro's domain was still lingering, like at the end of the Giggle. I'm pretty sure I've heard there was a line from the script that was not included or something like that that hinted at that, but I think there really needed to be a line or two in the episode explaining that, because it just wasn't clear and made the musical number feel even more tacked on than it already was. Overall, I think this was a very good episode of the show, with a great villain in Jinx Monsoon's Maestro. It is almost up there with Wild Blue Yonder for me. However, it's slightly let down by the tacked on musical number at the end, which doesn't have much of a function in the plot, and by some poor mistakes in either editing or episode placement, with that 6-month time jump and potentially other things that were cut from the episode. If I were to rank this episode on a tier list, I'm mostly thinking I'd give it an A rank at the moment, but it could go down to a B rank depending on on if my thoughts on it change a little bit later on down the line, and depending on the later episodes of this season, depending on how good they are. But for now, I'm going to put it at A rank, but maybe that'll change later on down the line. Okay, so this episode opens with a fairly extended cold open, perfectly setting up all the threads in this episode, such as the ambulances not being a good thing in this scenario, the effect the landmine has and how it works, as well as the guest characters that are relevant to the episode. And it does all of that, as well as the Doctor stepping on a landmine before the titles even start. We're also introduced to Varada Sethu's character in this cold open of this episode, who I thought did a great job in this story, and I'm very excited to see her return again next season as the companion, presumably as a new character from what we can tell, but it might somehow be related to this character in some way. But I talked more about that in the first impressions video. We did know she was going to be showing up earlier than season 2, but I wasn't expecting it to be this early, and it was a nice surprise. And like I said, I think she was great in this episode. We also get a number of other guest characters in this episode. Obviously there's the relationship between Mundi and Kanto, which, although wasn't the most convincing thing ever, I did genuinely cry when Kanto dies and she's speaking to the hologram. But I can see why some people didn't quite believe their relationship. And I can also see what some people were saying with the casting of Splice. It does seem like she was meant to be maybe played by a younger actor, and that would have probably worked a little bit better, but you know, casting for child actors is probably not the easiest thing in the world. As mentioned, this episode mostly consists of the Doctor being stuck on a landmine for most of the episode, unable to move, and I just think this episode is a masterclass in tension and suspense from Stephen Moffat, particularly the moment where Splice is running towards the Doctor and Ruby has to try and stop her, as well as the moment where Ruby is shot and the Doctor can't do anything about it. I think those moments were just great and really suspenseful and had a lot of tension in them. But just overall, this whole episode was incredibly tense, and Ncuti Gatwa and Millie Gibson's performances were incredible, particularly Ncuti Gatwa, as obviously Millie Gibson, or Ruby Sunday I should say, was dead for a lot of the episode, or dying for a lot of the episode, so was out of action for quite a lot of it. And if you weren't already convinced that Ncuti Gatwa is the Doctor before this episode, you certainly should be now. Now, as mentioned, there are a number of different themes throughout this episode, one of which is the theme around AI, particularly with the ambulances and the Villain Guard algorithm, which I've seen some people aren't the biggest fan of this theme, because it seems to be suggesting that AI isn't bad unless it's good AI, or the AI is bad until it isn't. However, I personally didn't read it that way. I personally took this as a message of humanity over AI, with the AI of John Francis Veta representing the humanity defeating the AI, not just that his AI is a good AI and the AI can be good, but I can personally see how people read it that way instead. As mentioned in my first impressions video, I think the theme that I latched onto the most was definitely the capitalism and warfare theme throughout this episode, and the revelation of the Anglicans actually fighting nobody, they're on an empty planet, although easy to predict, was a great one in my opinion. There is of course the theme of faith and religion throughout this episode as well, with the Doctor almost criticising faith in a way throughout the episode, but I think it's nice that it ends on a positive note with the Doctor seeing the benefits of it at the end of the episode. I know a lot of people are very annoyed about the Doctor's reaction or thoughts on faith in this episode, and they think it's very out of character for the Doctor, which I can see, but like I said, he does come around to it in the end, and I think a big part of that is just that he's obviously going to be a lot more spiteful early on in the episode whilst he's stuck on the landmine, and you know, he thinks Ruby's dead and there's nothing he can do about it, so I can kind of understand why he's more spiteful towards the other characters about faith and religion at the start, and why he's much more accepting of it at the end, when you take into consideration that he's under a lot of stress and pressure throughout the episode. So for me personally, I think it works quite well. Now, there's also a number of references in this episode, not only to previous Moffat episodes such as Villain Guard, the Anglican Marines, Fish Fingers and Custard, and the Doctor saying basically in a similar way to how he says basically run as the 11th Doctor, but also references to other eras such as the Doctor singing the Skyboat song, which is a song that the second Doctor has played on his recorder, as well as the reference to the mud aliens from the Witchfinders. I appreciate a lot of these references because they're kind of, some of them are almost like deep cuts, such as Villain Guard that was only barely mentioned in in Empty Child Dr. Dancers. Some of them are a little bit more obvious, like Fish Fingers and Custard, but I appreciate that Moffat returned and didn't just write like another Weeping Angel story or reintroduce the silence or something like that. So I think these references are quite nice, and it's obviously nice that some of the references aren't just to previous Moffat era episodes or episodes that Moffat has written before. There's obviously a few more story arc hints throughout this episode as well, with Ruby not knowing who her next of kin is, and the snow showing up again in the episode, which I think is very interesting to see. And also obviously Susan Twist is in this episode as well. I think my only issue with all of these story arc hints throughout the past few episodes is that we've had the same hints with the snow and Susan Twist in every episode so far. I think that's just kind of a downside of having a shorter episode count for this season, but it would have maybe been nice if we had these hints maybe every other episode instead of every episode as well. But there's obviously more hints at the Doctor's family as well in this episode, with him saying things like dad to dad and stuff like that, which could be more hints towards Susan returning towards the end of this season or at some point in this era. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Overall, I think this episode was a masterclass in tension and suspense, and in my opinion, it's a new all-timer from Stephen Moffat. This episode explores some great themes around AI, capitalism and warfare, and faith, with some nice references to not only previous Moffat episodes, but also other episodes from both the classic era and modern eras of the show. I'd personally say this is probably my favourite episode of the 15th Doctor era so far, and in terms of the RTD2 era, it's definitely up there with Wild Blue Yonder, probably the best episode since that. So for that reason, I'm mostly thinking of putting this episode in S tier, with the potential for it to be moved down to A tier if anything in this season somehow tops this episode. So obviously, like I said, the Doctor disappears at the start of this episode, which leaves Ruby Sunday on her own for the rest of the episode as the main character of this episode. This gives Millie Gibson the perfect opportunity to shine as Ruby Sunday in this episode, where she gives a great performance, which is really impressive considering this is the first episode she filmed of this season. If Boom is the episode that should sell you on Ncuti Gatwa as the Doctor, then 73 Yards is the episode that should sell you on Millie Gibson as Ruby Sunday. So Ruby also bumps into Susan Twist again in this episode as the hiker, but this time she actually recognizes her from the previous episode, forwarding this Susan Twist story arc a little bit further than it has been for the past few episodes, where the Doctor and Ruby haven't even really noticed her before. We then get a very good and tense scene in the pub. I know some people don't really like its portrayal of Welsh people, but bear in mind this is written by Russell T Davies, who is himself Welsh. I love the reveal of them just messing with Ruby. It makes you unsure of how much, if any, of what they said is actually true or real. I personally think none of it is real and it's just a red herring, but it's a really nice way of sowing some seeds of what could be happening in this episode and what the explanations could be, leaving the audience to kind of figure out which of the things they've said is actually true and actually happening. We also get the scenes with Ruby's mum, Carla, as well as Kate Stewart and Unit, where they're both turned away from Ruby after speaking to the woman, which really just shows how alone Ruby is with all this and how no one is able to help her. And the scene with Kate Stewart has a really great line in it, which I think is very important to this episode, but I'll touch on that more later on. So after all this happens, we then get a time jump to Ruby when she's about 40, I think. It is a little bit weird that the way that they've decided to age her up is basically just by putting glasses on her. I'm pretty sure from Unleashed you can see that she does technically have some prosthetics on. There's like some slight wrinkles in her forehead and stuff like that, and I think she was also coached on how to walk as if she was a 40-year-old, but that's honestly not that noticeable, so it does kind of just look like they've put some glasses on her, which is kind of funny. But for me personally, it doesn't really bother me that much. I thought Roger Ap Gwilliam was a good antagonist for this episode. My only issue is how long it takes to get to him and how little he's focused on in the episode. I know I've seen some people that aren't so happy about the whole abuse that is implied in this episode, which I fully appreciate and understand. For me, I think it really helps to show how terrible and obsessed with power he is, but I can see why those implied moments just kind of really aren't needed for some people and feel a little bit weird. In terms of Roger Ap Gwilliam himself, I think my personal interpretation is I personally like to think that he's just a normal human who is obsessed with power, and that him mentioning that his nickname was Mad Jack is just a coincidence that reminds Ruby of the Doctor mentioning him and what he did at the start of the episode. Hence why when Ruby uses the woman to make Roger Ap Gwilliam resign, she doesn't disappear until Ruby dies, as I think that's not what she was there for. I personally think there isn't actually a reason why the woman is there, but Ruby just finds one and makes one up, which I think is hinted at by what Kate says earlier on in the episode, where she says, "It's what we do, all of us. rules. We see something inexplicable and invent the rules to make it work. However, other people obviously are going to interpret this in a different way. That Mad Jack is an entity set free by the Doctor stepping in the fairy circle that is either possessed or manifested into Roger Ap William, which I think is just as valid of an interpretation, and personally what this episode is all about. The ambiguity of elements like this is personally what makes this episode so good in my opinion, but I'll get into that more later on. But before I get into most people's main issue with this episode, I think my main issue with this episode is the pacing and the political elements that seem a little bit rushed and half-baked. They sort of come out of nowhere, and I feel like this episode could have maybe benefited from being a two-parter, especially considering you can tell that they've tried to fit a lot into this episode, and it still ended up being 47 minutes long, which is longer than all the other episodes we've got so far in this season, and they still couldn't fit a title sequence at the start of this episode, although that might have been a creative decision. Either way, I think the lack of title sequence works for this. But yeah, I do think this maybe could have benefited from being a two-parter, with part 1 ending with Ruby seeing Roger Ap William on the TV announcing that he is running for Prime Minister, and her remembering what the Doctor said about him, and then part 2 focusing on the political elements and Ruby trying to take down Roger Ap William. Okay, so obviously a lot of people weren't happy with the ending of this episode as it leaves a lot of things unexplained. However, whilst I understand that criticism, it personally doesn't bother me. I personally like that this episode doesn't have an explanation for anything at the end. I think people are just so used to Doctor Who having a technobabble explanation behind it, but I think this episode really benefits from not having one, as it allows for some really unique and interesting interpretations, with people interpreting a lot of the elements of this episode in different and creative ways, such as my interpretation with Roger Ap William. The comparison I made on Twitter is you wouldn't watch Donnie Darko, for example, and complain that nothing in that film makes sense. The whole point of that film and this episode is that it's all up to the viewer's interpretation. The difference here is that Doctor Who is a sci-fi show that usually has a logical explanation to everything, although I guess technically Donnie Darko is sci-fi horror, which this episode sort of is as well. However, with that being said, I do understand some of the criticisms. For example, if Ruby is the woman, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum? I think that doesn't make too much sense when you think about it, but personally I don't think the solution to that would be knowing what the woman is saying. Not knowing what the woman was saying is personally one of my favourite things about this episode, as it leaves a lot to the audience's imagination, and whatever it would have been revealed to be is not going to be as good as what you could think of in your head, or what you don't know. So I really don't know what they could have done there. Maybe not making Ruby be the woman or something like that, but I personally don't think finding out what the woman was saying is the solution to that. The woman also isn't played by the same person who plays the older version of Ruby, so I guess maybe Ruby only inhabits the woman's body for a short period of time at the end or something like that. I think the main difference in whether or not people came out of this episode enjoying it or not mostly came down to how people approached the episode. I feel like people who didn't really like this episode or are annoyed about the ending of this episode approached this as a mystery that was going to be solved, which isn't really their own fault. But myself, and I assume the other people who also really liked this episode, were just along for the ride and saw it as more of an episode that was taking us on a journey. A lot of people are also annoyed, saying that all of this was pointless because Ruby doesn't remember it and lost all of her character growth, but I personally disagree with that, because she says at the end of the episode that she's been to Wales 3 times instead of 2 times like she said at the start. So although she doesn't actually seem to remember any of it, it's definitely stayed with her somehow, which to me suggests that the character growth that she gets in this episode has also stayed with her, even if she can't fully remember what happened. I've also seen a lot of people saying that they hope we get more answers later on in the season about this episode, but I personally don't hope we get any answers later on in the season, and I don't think we will. Like I said, for me, the ambiguity is what makes this episode, and so explaining things later on down the line would personally ruin it for me. And I also think it just seems like this story is finished, as much as people would like some explanations for it. I just personally don't see it being revisited, and personally don't want it to be, but that's just my opinion. Overall, I think 73 Yards is a great episode that thrives on ambiguity. However, some of the political content in this episode does feel somewhat rushed and half-baked, and could have maybe benefited from being 2 parts. This episode leaves you with more questions than answers, which for the most part I think is to its benefit, and leaves you thinking about it long after it's finished. However, some of the questions do bring up some genuine criticisms, such as if the woman is meant to be Ruby, why would she say something so horrible to her own mum and turn her against herself? But for the most part, I think this episode wouldn't work without its ambiguity, as it leads to a lot of creative interpretations, which I think was intentional. With that being said, I can see why this episode didn't land for some people, especially if they approached it as a mystery to be solved instead of a journey, which is no fault of their own. Because of the high expectations I had for this episode, after my first viewing I was mostly thinking of ranking this episode underneath Boom, but the more I thought about this episode, the more I liked it, and after a second viewing of this episode, I really loved it. So I'm now thinking of ranking this alongside Boom in S tier. Okay, so at the start of this episode, we're introduced to our main character and audience POV, Lindy-Pepper-Bean. I think Lindy-Pepper-Bean was portrayed brilliantly by Callie Cook. I know some people have an issue with how unlikable she is, especially considering she's the main character of the episode. And while I do understand that, I think that Callie Cook and also the writing of this episode did a great job at making us think that as annoying as this character is, she could still be redeemed by the end of the episode. Although we obviously now know that didn't end up happening, which I think is a great twist that I'll get to later on in this review. As well, the Doctor and Ruby don't appear a whole lot throughout this episode, which I know some people have been slightly annoyed at because we just had a Dr. Light episode the week before. But for me, their presence is definitely felt a lot more in this episode, and I would agree with some of the early reviews of this episode saying that it's more of a Dr. Light-ish story than a Dr. Light episode. If this episode was completely Dr. Light like the week before, I could see them being back to back as being a lot more of an issue than this episode actually is. Because like I said, I think their presence is felt a lot more throughout this episode. So the social commentary in this episode is probably my favourite part about this episode, and definitely the thing that surprised me the most about this episode, because like I mentioned, I initially thought the social commentary in this episode was just going to be about social media and being obsessed with being on your phone, not looking what you're doing, and just kind of scrolling through social media wherever you are, which I was really worried about, especially with it being written by Russell T Davies, who's in his 60s now. So I was worried that this social media commentary was going to be quite bad, and while this social media commentary is in there, and there's definitely a lot of those negatives in there that I was worried about, I personally think the social media commentary is actually only the smallest part of the social commentary in this episode, and I think a lot of people have misinterpreted the rest of this episode as just being that social media commentary, when in actuality I think the main point of this episode and the main social commentary is around social divisions, particularly with classism and elitism, with some people even misconstruing the ending of this episode as also being about classism and elitism. And while that definitely does play a part in the final scene of this episode, to me and a lot of other people it was very clear that that final scene is meant to be mostly about racism, but obviously still with hints of classism and elitism in there. But I'll get more onto the final scene later on. Now, this middle act of the episode is where one of my main issues with this episode arises, and that's the pacing issues, because this part of the episode is where the pacing really starts to meander a little bit for me, because the middle of the episode sees the characters mostly just sat in one place talking to each other over their screens. For example, I think the scene where Lindy-Pepper-Bean is at work, along with the scene where she is hiding from the slugs and talking to the Doctor, both go on for a little bit too long, which leads to the pacing really meandering a lot in the middle. But I can understand this because obviously a lot of the episode does kind of need to consist of people talking through screens. It's just kind of unfortunate that they are kind of sat in one place for a long time. Now, the pacing of this episode definitely starts to pick up a bit again when we're finally introduced to Ricky September in the flesh. Ricky September is probably one of my favourite characters in this episode because you really don't expect him to be the best person in this story, besides obviously the Doctor, because when we're first introduced to him in the cold open of this episode, he just seems like he's just like everybody else, dancing along to some music and posting these dances on social media and being trapped in his bubble like everybody else in Fine Time. But when we finally meet him, we realise he's not like that at all, and he actually spends most of his time outside of the bubble with his dot turned off. Now, when I was watching this episode, I realised Ricky was giving off a lot of Doctor vibes, as he was pretty much acting exactly like the Doctor would, which I didn't really understand when I was first watching the episode. But a lot of people have pointed this out since watching the episode, that this Doctor analogy was probably intentional, because it shows that Lindy would have trusted the Doctor if he was white, because Ricky acts pretty much exactly like the Doctor and Lindy trusts him straight away, which I definitely think was the intention behind this. Now, a lot of people still aren't sure whether or not we should like Ricky or not, because there's a possibility that he could also be racist as well. But for me personally, I definitely read it as him not being that, because as we know, he spends most of his time outside of the bubble, which is meant to be kind of an analogy for this echo chamber that they're all in. And we also know that he's spent his time reading up on a lot of history, and he also seems a lot less confrontational and more accepting when speaking to the Doctor, in my opinion. So for me personally, I do think Ricky is a good character, and I think the intention behind behind him was that he isn't meant to be racist like everybody else. We then get the reveal that the Dots have created the man-traps and have been killing the residents of Find Time in alphabetical order, which if you've seen my first impressions video on this episode, you'll know I wasn't the biggest fan of this reveal. Now, I have slightly been swayed on the idea of them killing in alphabetical order now, after some discussions on Twitter and stuff like that, as people have pointed out that this kind of would make sense considering the Dot is basically a computer system and an algorithm, so it kind of makes sense that it would kill in alphabetical order, which I do agree with, and I have slightly been swayed on that opinion, but I still think it would have been a good idea to maybe have the reveal be something slightly different, such as the follow account suggestion that I mentioned in my first impressions video, just so that it could be something a little bit more satisfying and could play into the social commentary aspect of this episode a lot more. I'm also not too keen on the idea of the Dots creating the man-traps, because it kind of leaves questions of how they were able to create the man-traps in the first place and why they would create the man-traps, especially when we know the Dots can just kill people immediately if they wanted to. I did think maybe it was possible that the Dots would have let the man-traps in from the wild woods, but the Doctor does imply that the Dots created the man-traps, and if they had been let in from the wild woods, that wouldn't really explain how they're able to basically program the man-traps to eat them in alphabetical order. But then again, it does lead us to have this really good creature design of the episode, so it's not really a big flaw in my opinion. Now, we then also get the moment where Lindy basically throws Ricky under the bus by revealing that his surname actually begins with a C and that he changed it to September later on, leading to the Dots killing Ricky instead of killing Lindy, which I think is probably one of the main reasons why they chose to do the killing in alphabetical order thing, instead of having it be some other reveal that would be more satisfying to the social commentary of the episode. And this is obviously a great opportunity to show Lindy's true colours ahead of the final scene. And that leads us into the final scene, where we obviously learn that the residents of Find Time don't accept the Doctor's help because they're all racist and they don't want to go with him because he's black, which I was surprised to find out that some people didn't actually get that that's what this scene was about. But like I said, this scene does obviously still have elements of classism and elitism in there, so I guess people who didn't see that weren't completely wrong. But for me personally, I think the racism in this scene was fairly obvious, especially with a lot of the lines about voodoo and contamination in there. And when you really think about it, and especially if you rewatch this episode, the hints about their racism become a lot more clear throughout, which I think is why this episode benefits so much with rewatchability. I think Ncuti's performance in this moment is absolutely incredible, especially considering it's the first thing he filmed for season 1, and it's definitely a defining 15th Doctor moment. It's probably the defining 15th Doctor moment of this season for me so far. I think my only criticism, and this isn't necessarily for this episode in particular, but for the season as a whole, is that he's cried in pretty much every episode he's been in so far, and while I definitely think it was incredibly warranted in this episode, I think it would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried in pretty much every episode so far. I think for me personally, the episodes where it makes the most sense were definitely The Church on Ruby Road, Boom, and of course this episode, but I think if he hadn't cried in the other episodes as well as that, this would have been a lot more impactful of a moment. But like I said, that's not really criticism of this episode in particular. I just think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't cried so much in previous episodes. This isn't me saying that I don't think this Doctor should be more emotional, I just don't think it was as necessary in episodes like Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, and if he hadn't cried in those episodes, it would have made this moment a lot more impactful for me. But like I said, this moment was still incredibly impactful for me and is definitely the 15th Doctor's most defining moment so far. In conclusion, Dot and Bubble is an episode that really surprised me. I expected it to be a boring and annoying commentary on social media and one of the weaker episodes of the season. However, although there is definitely some of that social media commentary in there, it's not the main focus of the social commentary in this episode. And I really liked the social commentary on class divisions such as class, elitism, and of course racism. And that final scene solidifies this episode as one of the best of the season for me, and a defining moment for the 15th Doctor. I wasn't expecting this episode to be ranked very highly, but after watching it, like I mentioned, I was pleasantly surprised by it. After my first viewing, I was mostly thinking this episode was a fairly mid episode with a great ending. However, after seeing some discussions of it on Twitter, similar to 73 Yards, I started to like it a lot more. And also similar to 73 Yards, I enjoyed this episode even more on rewatch and definitely think it benefits with watching it again. For that reason, this episode has become one of my favourite episodes of this season so far, which really surprised me. Because of that, I'm going to put Dot and Bubble in A tier, and I'm going to move The Devil's Chord down to a B tier. Okay, so like I just mentioned in the intro of this video, this episode definitely feels like more of a return to the status quo, and it feels like the first standard Doctor Who episode we've had since Space Babies. Every episode since that has been pretty experimental or has been Doctor Light, and I think that's definitely a downside of the shorter episode count, but like I said, this episode is like a return to the status quo, and it feels like it would fit right into the first RTD era in my opinion. We have the main villains of this episode being the Yonder, who are a fun but fairly standard Doctor Who villain, which once again we've not really had since Space Babies, but they definitely had a much more unique and interesting motivation, with them wanting to cosplay, or more accurately LARP, all across the universe. However, they're not incredibly fleshed out or focused on in this episode, but that's because the focus of this episode isn't really on the Yonder, it's on the Doctor and Rogue. Okay, so I think the introduction of the character Rogue is done really well. I think I've heard someone else mention it in this way, I can't remember who, but it feels like Rogue is the main character in his own story somewhere, and we're just kind of entering his story. You can kind of imagine him going off already doing these different bounty hunting missions and stuff like that. So I think that really fleshes the character out nicely. There's obviously also the scene in Rogue's spaceship, which I think was really good. It was another fun scene where we learn a lot more about Rogue as a character, and although I liked the moment, I do feel like the Kylie Minogue music, the moment with that goes on for maybe a little bit too long, but I did still enjoy it, like I say. Obviously in this scene as well, we also get the moment with the holograms of the Doctor's previous faces, where we get a look at Richard E. Grant's Schalke Doctor, or what is assumed to be the Schalke Doctor, but it could also be maybe the Curse of Fatal Death Doctor. And for me personally, I don't think this really means anything. I think it is just a fun little Easter egg for people that know about it, which I think is nice, but you know, it could also maybe be hinting at different timelines or parallel universes or something like that, but I personally don't think that's what it's about. Now, I personally think the Doctor and Rogue had really good chemistry, but I can sort of agree with some people who think their relationship was slightly rushed, as it was all in one episode. However, the scene with them connecting in the TARDIS, for me, really helped solidify their relationship. It's also nice to see a scene inside the TARDIS interior in this episode, because we haven't really been inside the TARDIS since the first week with Space Babies and the Devil's Chord, and I feel like that's really been missing this season, which is weird, especially considering how large and especially expensive this TARDIS set must have been. It's a little bit odd that we haven't seen it more because of that. Okay, so Ruby sort of gets a little bit sidelined in this episode in favour of focusing on the Doctor and Rogue, which is a bit unfortunate because we haven't had much of a sense of the Doctor and Ruby's relationship this season, particularly since Boom, besides the fact that they're just having a lot of fun, which makes it feel a little bit out of place when the Doctor calls her his best friend in this episode, although I do personally believe it because we know how long they've been travelling for now. It would have still been nice if we could have seen it more this season. With that being said, I still quite like Ruby's subplot in this episode. The conversations with Ruby and Emily are very good, but they are let down a little bit by the reveal of Emily being a Yonder. But I think Ruby's subplot also nicely feeds into the end of this episode and fits really well with the ending, even if it does feel like she's sidelined for most of the episode. Okay, so when it comes to the ending of this episode, obviously we get the moment where the Doctor thinks Ruby has been turned into a Yonder or has been killed and the Yonder is playing her, which I think was a pretty good reveal that was set up well with the battle mode mention at the start of the episode. And I didn't personally see it coming straight away, but I did start to figure it out and put the pieces together before it was actually revealed to us. But with that being said, I do feel like it was a little bit unfair on the audience, because we saw the shot of them screaming and the lightning coming from the doorway, and we also had the moments where Ruby's neck is cracking, suggesting that she's a Yonder, which don't really make sense when you find out that she isn't actually a Yonder, and that she fought off the Yonder that was pretending to be Emily. I also think the moment with the Doctor wanting the Yonder to suffer after thinking Ruby was dead was personally very in character. We've seen it before in episodes like Family of Blood and Heaven Sent. However, it doesn't really make much sense, as we know he already changed the settings of the Triform before this point, so the fate of the Yonder was already the same before he thought Ruby was dead anyway. Once again, we have the Doctor crying in this episode, which I think it makes sense for this episode personally, especially when he thinks Ruby is dead. It works less for Rogue because he only just met him, but like I said, I personally buy their chemistry. But I still think this would have been a lot more impactful if he hadn't already cried in every episode so far. For example, if he didn't cry in Space Babies or The Devil's Chord, where I personally don't think it was as needed as the other episodes. I also think this moment would have been a lot more impactful if the flashback moment we had already been in one of the episodes of this season before, instead of being written and filmed just for this moment. For example, if they managed to fit it in the end of Space Babies or The Devil's Chord or Boom or something like that. We obviously have the moment where the Doctor and Rogue kiss, which is very satisfying because it gives us a payoff for their relationship in this episode, but it's also there for Rogue to take the Triform activation device off of the Doctor, so it works both if you did or didn't buy their chemistry or relationship in this episode. We obviously have the moment where Rogue sacrifices himself to swap with Ruby on the Triform, which some people understandably don't like, as surely she could have just come off it some other way if Rogue was just able to shove her off. But personally, I think it's well set up, as we know there's a limit of only 6 people on the Triform, so if an extra person like Rogue goes on there, Ruby would be able to leave as it can only carry 6 people. And then we get the moment at the end of this episode where the Doctor is on about going to save Rogue one day. I know some people aren't happy with this moment, as it seems like the Doctor gives up trying to find Rogue very quickly, with the comments about different dimensions and not knowing his name, but I personally read this moment as him going to save Rogue one day when he finds out how to, especially with him parking Rogue's ship and wearing the ring as a reminder. In conclusion, I think Rogue was a fun episode of Season 1 and a nice return to the status quo, which I think was needed with most of the episodes being more experimental this season and with the shorter episode count not allowing for as many filler episodes. I think it was a very serviceable plot that would fit perfectly into the first RTD era, with fun villains in the shoulder. However, the villains clearly aren't supposed to be the main focus of this episode, with that being the relationship between the Doctor and Rogue, who I think was a great new character with good chemistry between the pair. For me personally, I think I'm going to rank this at B tier with the Devil's Chord, because although I really liked it, there are still some issues with it, and it is at the end of the day a fairly standard episode of Doctor Who, which I'm happy for because I feel like that was missing from this season. Okay, so The Legend of Ruby Sunday opens up with a red herring of S-Triad Technologies being an anagram for TARDIS technology, which I think was a clever thing to get out of the way in the cold open, as they were already expecting fans to have picked up on this, which they had, but they likely weren't expecting fans to have picked up on the correct anagram, Sutek, if you can even call that an anagram. But overall, I think this was a very clever thing to get out of the way, and to even have the unit team dismissing as something being so obvious and easy, because a lot of the audience already figured it out before this episode had even aired, and so it just shows that Russell T Davies already knew that would be the case, and it's just getting straight into it. We also immediately jump off with the Doctor and Ruby speculating as to whether or not Susan Triad could be the Doctor's granddaughter, Susan, adding to the red herrings in this episode. There's a nice moment between the Doctor and Kate Stewart where they discuss whether or not the Doctor wants it to be Susan, which I personally had hoped would lead to the Doctor choosing to go and see her at the end of the second part, which unfortunately doesn't happen. However, she still does get a mention, with him saying he'll eventually find her one day. My main issue with the Susan Triad stuff in this story is that once she is revealed to be a minion of Sutek at the end of the first part, that is all she is throughout the whole of the second part. There's no more mention of Triad Technologies or what that was all about, and Triad Technologies was set up in the Giggle with RTD hinting that it would have some huge ramifications for UNIT, but ultimately it's never brought up again, with Kate Stewart offering Susan a job at UNIT at the end of the second part, which doesn't make sense knowing she's already a tech billionaire. Ultimately, most of this first episode is just set up for the next part, which for me leads to a pace that is very meandering, with not a lot actually happening and it mostly taking place all in one location inside of UNIT, which doesn't feel really good on the pacing of the episode. The Sutek cliffhanger is probably my favourite part of this story. Even though it was speculated that Sutek would be the main villain of this story, I honestly wasn't sure if it would actually happen, because it was never actually leaked, just heavily speculated based on the Sutek anagram, the dust in the trailers, and so on. RTD was definitely right when he said to film the reactions to this story, because if I did, you would have seen that I went crazy because I just didn't expect it to actually happen. I also really liked the opening action sequence to Empire of Death. However, everyone dying at the start made it very clear that there was just going to be an inevitable reset button at the end of the episode. When Kate died, I assumed it was possible that that was it for her, but still unlikely. But as soon as Carla, Cherry, and Mrs. Flood, who's hinted at having future plans, died alongside Kate Stewart, I knew that this would all be reset by the end of the episode, which definitely lowers the stakes significantly. As much as I said I loved the cliffhanger to the first episode, I think the first episode could have benefited from the cliffhanger actually being the moment where Kate Stewart dies, because it means the stakes would have felt higher at the end of the episode and shown the power of Sutek, instead of just removing the stakes at the start of the next episode and making it obvious that there was inevitably going to be a reset button at the end. It also would have allowed for the pacing of the first episode to feel less meandering, as some of the slower moments could have been cut down to fit this moment in as the cliffhanger. As well as this, it would have also allowed us to spend more time exploring the desolation in the second part, as the opening to the second part would have been the ending to the previous part, allowing for more time for this desolation of Earth and other planets to be shown. The moments in the memory TARDIS is nice for the episode to take a a bit of a breather, and I love the moment where the Doctor is screaming into the void of space, although this moment would have been more impactful if the Doctor hadn't cried in every episode so far. But it does also make it feel like this episode quickly comes to a halt and doesn't feel as large scale as it could, with us not really getting to see the desolation on Earth from a ground level and feel the stakes. We then have a bit of a time jump where we have a nice human moment with the Doctor and a woman who's all on her own and losing her memories. Like I said, this is a nice human moment for the episode, but once again it would have been nice to see more of the desolation outside of this scene, and ultimately this scene only leads to the Doctor getting a spoon to make the screen work better. We then see Roger Ap Gwilliam from 73 yards appear on the screen, and for a second I was worried we were going to get answers about 73 yards, which if you've seen my review on that episode you'll know is something that I don't want. Luckily this is just a small moment that doesn't ruin 73 yards for me and ultimately has very little impact on that episode, which I'm happy about. Now I know some people are annoyed that this moment wasn't actually in 73 yards, or even think that it may have been a deleted scene from 73 yards, but for me this really doesn't bother me, as mandatory DNA testing is something that would be very in character for Roger Ap Gwilliam's authoritarian government, but it maybe still would have been nice to see this moment actually in 73 yards. After the reveal of Sutekh in the first part, I was really hoping we would see a more classic Sutekh design in the second part. Unfortunately, we didn't get that, but I do think he looks a lot better in Empire of Death than he did at the end of Legend of Ruby Sunday. I particularly like the moment where he's leaning over the TARDIS like it's nothing and even spins it around at one point. With all that being said, Sutekh is unfortunately barely in the second part and his presence isn't really felt, but when he is there, he is incredibly voiced by the returning Gabriel Wolf, who absolutely still has it at the age of 91. Now, Sutekh's defeat is definitely one of the most disappointing moments in this episode for most people. I personally don't mind as much him being dragged by a big dog lead and flown through the time vortex. It's something that I think is a nice play on him being portrayed as basically a big dog, and is well set up with the reintroduction of the intelligent gloves and the introduction of the intelligent rope earlier on in the episode. And it also leads to some nice visuals as they're flying him through the time vortex, with the Doctor shouting to him through the TARDIS doors. However, it's definitely odd that they decided to defeat a villain who has been set up to be so powerful in this way, especially when we know that sending Sutekh into the time vortex is how the Fourth Doctor originally thought he had defeated him in the first place, which ultimately ended up not being the case. I also think the explanation for how everybody is brought back to life is very half-baked and not well explained, leading to it ultimately just feeling like a big reset button that magically brings everybody back to life. I think Ruby's mother being revealed to be an ordinary person was definitely the right way to go, and was what I was hoping for. It's a good response to the terrible decision Star Wars made with The Rise of Skywalker by reversing the decision of Rey being a nobody and instead making her a Palpatine. But this does ultimately lead to some questions about things that were set up previously in the season relating to Ruby, such as it snowing around her whenever she thought about the night that she was abandoned, and why her mother was dressed in a cult-like robe when abandoning her at the church on Ruby Road. The moment where she points at the street sign is also very laughable, especially when it was established as being a changed memory earlier on in the season, and the sign not even being visible in the scene in the church on Ruby Road. Ruby's exit is one of my favourite scenes in this episode, and gives a perfect excuse as to why she needs to leave the show, at least for the time being, because as much as she wants to continue travelling with the Doctor, she has more important things going on at home. However, this moment is let down by two things for me personally. Number one, we really haven't had enough episodes or screen time with these two to really establish their relationship and chemistry, with this season only being 8 episodes long and them not always being together in a lot of the episodes. And number two, the Doctor crying, although warranted in this particular scene, is made less impactful due to the fact that he's cried in every episode up until this point, excluding 73 yards, which he was barely in. And as mentioned earlier, I also think it would have been nice if the Doctor went to see his granddaughter Susan after this moment, as it would have made all the Susan teasing in the previous episode feel a lot less like just a red herring, and more like something that was linked to the themes and arcs of this season, and would have felt like a lot more of a satisfactory payoff to her mentions in both the Devil's Chord and the previous episode. Overall, although I seem to have enjoyed this finale more than most people, it still isn't perfect and is definitely RTD's worst finale yet. Despite the incredible cliffhanger, the first part is mostly set up with a meandering pace, with the second part, although being a fun ride, ends with an unsatisfactory conclusion with the defeat of Sutekh and the reveal of Ruby's lineage that in some ways leaves more questions than answers. If I were to rank these episodes, I'd probably put The Legend of Ruby Sunday at B tier, with The Empire of Death at C or D tier. Okay, so this episode opens with the pre-title sequence, which was what we got in the first preview, I believe at San Diego Comic-Con earlier this year, which was a fun way to open the episode, even if I slightly clocked out at that point because I'd seen that clip many times because of breaking it down for the channel. But I like how after this pre-title sequence and after the title sequence itself, we then actually jump back a little bit and we're kind of telling the story in a kind of non-linear approach, which kind of happens a bit more throughout this episode as well, although the kind of non-linear storytelling towards the end of the episode is more to do with kind of the time travel aspects than them just choosing to tell it out of order. But it was something I kind of appreciated about this episode, at least for this first scene, although I do feel like that non-linear approach later on in the episode does slightly affect the pacing a little bit. But to be fair, I've only really fully watched this episode once at the point of this first initial review, so that might change when I watch it or rewatch it later on down the line. We're then introduced to the Time Hotel, which is a very cool and fun location for this episode for a fun little Christmas special, and having them celebrating Christmas everywhere all at once is a nice fun little Christmas twist to an episode that overall doesn't feel all that Christmassy, besides that kind of Christmas deal that they're doing at the Time Hotel and obviously the whole stuff with the star and stuff like that at the end of the episode. We're also introduced to Trev, who was a character that I really liked in this episode. I've seen Joel Fry before in Our Flag Means Death, and he's one of my favourite characters in that show, and I think he was also great in this show, or in this episode, even if he does die pretty early on in the episode. But that brief team up we get with the Doctor and Trev early on is a really fun dynamic, and it's not like he's gone for the rest of the episode after he dies. He does obviously come back as a hologram as well, which is nice. And you just feel really sad for the character because you can tell how sad he feels about letting down the Doctor on this mission when he starts to disintegrate. Similarly, you also feel really sad when the Silurian Melnak dies in this episode, who doesn't play as big of a part as I would have expected from him appearing in the preview that we had for this episode. I kind of expected him to be the main villain, but instead it turns out this villain guard briefcase that contains the starseed actually hypnotizes and mind controls the people that it attaches to, which I think was a nice fun twist that I didn't expect to be a part of the episode. However, the main issue with this approach is, although Joy is meant to be our companion throughout this episode and is basically touted as the big guest star for this episode, we don't actually get a whole lot of her in this because, number one, the Doctor has to spend a whole year somewhere without her, which I will get to. And then when we do actually get to spend time with Joy, she's being mind controlled and hypnotized by this briefcase for the most part. So unfortunately, as good as Nicola Coughlan is in this episode, the character of Joy herself does get significantly sidelined in this episode, which is really unfortunate. But obviously this isn't a problem for a lot of people, as we do also have the character of Anita, which is a character that people have been loving from what I've seen on Twitter and stuff like that. I don't think I've seen a single person say a bad thing about the character of Anita, because obviously there's this moment in like kind of the midsection or maybe towards the beginning of the episode where the Doctor has to spend a year staying and working at the normal hotel, the Sandringham Hotel in London, whilst he waits for another door of the Time Hotel to open a year later. Now obviously a lot of people, like I said, have loved the character of Anita, and while I did like the character of Anita, I don't think I enjoyed this part of the episode as much as a lot of people I've seen online did. Obviously I really liked Anita just like everybody else, but this part of the episode to me does feel like a bit of a weird detour from the rest of the episode that kind of messes with the pacing and kills the episode dead in its tracks to kind of have this fun little relationship between the Doctor and Anita take place, which like I said I do enjoy, but it does feel like a bit of a detour from the rest of the episode. And obviously with, like I mentioned earlier on, Joy already being sidelined in the episode because of her being mind controlled and hypnotized, her also being taken out of the episode for this whole year of the Doctor living in Sandringham Hotel doesn't really help that, unfortunately. But yeah, it does lead to this great dynamic between the Doctor and Anita, so there is some positives there, and it does ultimately make sense as we need an excuse for the Doctor to figure out this code for the briefcase and figure out what's going on with the starseed. But like I said, I just think unfortunately it is a bit of a detour from the episode itself and kind of messes with the pacing a little bit in my opinion, but maybe that'll change when I rewatch this episode a bit more. And although like I said I do like Anita much like everybody else I've seen, for me personally I still actually think the emotional scenes between the Doctor and Joy and the Doctor and Melnak the Silurian were actually more impactful to me than the moment of the Doctor leaving Anita personally, which I think a lot of people are probably going to disagree with me on that. And then obviously in this episode we have a great moment from the Doctor, which I think Stephen Moffat had previously hinted at in the commentary for Boom, where he said we're going to get some moments of this Doctor being really mean, which I was very excited to see. At first I had thought this is going to be a moment between himself when we've got the two different Doctors, which we do kind of get a bit of him like arguing with himself and being a little bit mean, but clearly this was actually referring to the Doctor being mean to Joy to snap her out of this trance that the briefcase had her in, which I think was a great moment between the pair. Like I said, I just wish we would have got more of those two together and Joy actually being herself. But that moment between the Doctor and Joy was a great moment, and the reveal of why Joy doesn't like Christmas was really heartbreaking, and now I guess COVID is officially confirmed as part of the Doctor Who universe. Even if it's not specifically mentioned, it's clear that that's what it's about, and there's a nice little jab at the Tories in there. But with that being said, I think my main issue with this episode is, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think Villengard's plan is really specifically spelled out of what they're trying to do. Obviously they're trying to grow this star using the starseed and making use of the time hotel to have enough time to, as the Doctor says, microwave this star. But from what I can remember, I don't think there's specifically a reason given as to what they're growing this star for, whether it's a power source or a weapon. And if it is a weapon, I don't think it's specifically said what it's being used for, who it's being used to fight, anything like that. So, like I said, tell me if I'm wrong in the comments down below, but unfortunately I don't think that's mentioned in the episode, and I think that does really let it down a bit. I also think the moment after Joy has turned into this star, where we see Joy's mum looking up at the stars on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day, I can't remember exactly when it is, as she's dying and clearly knowing or thinking that that's got something to do with Joy, is a very nice scene, and a very heartwarming and heartbreaking scene, an emotional scene. But I do personally think it was a bit of a weird choice to have Joy's mum also kind of disintegrate and become a part of this star. I think it would have been nice if it was just kind of clear that Joy's mum kind of acknowledged that this had something to do with Joy and then just peacefully, you know, passed away. I think that would have been a lot more powerful, but that's just a minor nitpick I have of the episode. And obviously at the end of the episode we get this controversial moment, or, you know, a lot of the reviews or early reviews for the episode were saying that there's a controversial moment in this episode, and a lot of people had guessed that it was probably going to be something to do with the North Star and, you know, its relation to like the birth of Jesus and the nativity and stuff like that. And I thought that that was a big possibility as well, and as soon as we got the line early on in this episode where the Doctor said something about no wonder there's no room at the inn, I knew we were going to get something about that in this episode. I knew those guesses were right. But this big controversial moment in the episode is a reveal that the location where Joy became this big star was Bethlehem on the night Jesus was born. And it doesn't really go any further than that. I was expecting, with all these early reviews saying that it was such a controversial moment, that it would have gone even further than that, and, you know, we'd see kind of the Doctor trying to get to one of these inns or something like that, and maybe we'd see like baby Jesus himself or something along those lines. But really it is just a little nod, if not a bit of an obvious one, at the nativity story itself. And if it went any further than it actually did, I think maybe it could be seen as controversial or maybe a little bit cringe. But I think they went just enough with it where it's just like a little cheeky nod at that kind of Christmassy reference, and nothing in my opinion that was too controversial really. I think the only issue I really have with this moment is I think they should have left out the title card at the end where it says Bethlehem 0001, because I think we could have pieced that together ourselves and been able to tell exactly what it meant. So, the Robot Revolution opens with a cold open that for me personally seemed a little bit rushed and a bit choppy, but this is probably the only pacing issue I have with the episode, which I'll discuss more later on in this video. Also, seeing the Doctor just wandering around without interacting with Belinda felt a little bit weird, but it does make sense considering he needs to meet her later on in the episode instead of in this cold open when she's working at the hospital. But something about it did just feel a little bit weird to me, even though it makes sense for the story as a whole. I've also seen a lot of people point out that the Doctor quite likely killed a lot of people in the hospital by shutting off their power, but to be fair, as far as I know, most hospitals do have backup generators just in case a power cut does happen, so it's probably fine. But that is a funny moment in the episode that was a little bit weird. Okay, so also as part of the cold open after this hospital sequence, we obviously get the robots coming in to kidnap Belinda Chandra, with one of the robots killing a cat, which was a bit of a weird moment, and it's kind of weird that I had such a negative reaction to this moment in this episode considering a lot of people die in this episode. But all I can think is just imagine if this was a dog instead of a cat. For some reason, I just don't think they would do that, but at least they don't actually show the cat before it's killed, because that would maybe have been a step too far. But I did think that was a bit of a weird moment. But like I say, a lot of people die in this episode, and no one's really bothered about that, besides one particular character, which I'll get into later on. We obviously have Mrs. Flood as well in this cold open, who's now Belinda's neighbour, which is an interesting development. I'm still not too invested in this mystery, especially after the revelations at the end of season 1, but I did love her lines and delivery in this particular moment, and how clearly none of this is phasing her. Like, she doesn't care that there's robots coming down and kidnapping Belinda. And I do think the "you ain't seen me" line is probably the best fourth wall break Mrs. Flood has had so far, or at least my favourite. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Okay, and as for the main story, when we're on the planet Miss Belinda Chandra, we have the cool moment with every 9th word not being heard by the robots, which I thought was a very cool moment when it first happens, when we're first introduced to the Doctor, or the Doctor's introducing himself to Belinda as the historian of this planet. Although I don't feel like we needed the supercut flashback immediately after we'd just seen the 9th word thing explained, as it was fairly obvious which words the Doctor was stressing and what he was trying to get across to Belinda. But I guess that's maybe there just for the younger people watching in the audience, so it was a little bit annoying, but I guess if it helps like the kids watching it understand what's going on a bit better, then it's fair enough. But this every 9th word thing, while it is cool in this initial scene where it first happens, it does seem very quickly dropped for most of the episode, and it's not really focused on or utilized again until it's brought back at the end of the episode, which I'll get onto later. Like, if somebody did a supercut of every 9th word in this episode, the robots must have missed a lot of important words after this point, because no one's utilizing that trick or anything like that. So a lot of the sentences that are being said to the robots must make not that much sense to them, or maybe some important words are left out of some of those sentences if someone went back and kind of figured out what words were missing. So it is kind of weird that it's kind of dropped until it comes back later on in the episode. Obviously we have Sasha 55 in this episode as well. First of all, a lot of people were saying that she's badly acted, which I personally don't agree with. She does seem a little bit off when she's first welcoming Belinda to the planet, but that is because she's putting on a facade, so I don't personally think this character's portrayal was all that bad. But we also don't see much of it anyway, so there wasn't much opportunity for the actor to kind of sink their teeth into or anything like that, but I personally don't think the acting was that bad. Obviously we do then have the moment where Sasha 55 is killed by the robots, which was very obviously telegraphed to the audience that she was about to die when the Doctor was promising her a trip through the stars after they've defeated the robots. Like, I'm pretty sure everybody saw that coming when that moment happened. And while it makes sense for the Doctor to have such a strong reaction to Sasha's death, because obviously he's known her for 6 months at this point, she's basically been his companion since he landed on this planet, it does feel weird for us as an audience that it's given that much attention, considering we've only known her for about a minute or two. And obviously people already have an issue with the Doctor crying a lot in this era. I don't personally have an issue with him crying, but it does make me worry that more emotional moments won't be as impactful when they happen later on in the season because of it. And like I said, with this moment in particular, although it does make sense because of the Doctor's connection to Sasha 55, we've not really had that connection with her at all because we've known her for about a minute or two at this point in the episode, so it doesn't really work as an audience, even if it does kind of make sense in the context of the story. But it doesn't bug me that much, and at least it's not brought up too much, or at least the crying aspect kind of happens once, and then, you know, it's brought up again for Manny to be mad at Belinda about and stuff like that, which I think is fair enough. But my main thing is I'm just really hoping this doesn't affect any more impactful emotional moments later on in the season. Obviously, the big part of this particular episode and the start of this season is our introduction to Belinda Chandra, who I really like in this episode. We get a moment quite early on after they've escaped the robots and they're in the Undercity, where the Doctor starts trying to explain the stuff with the star certificate to her, but Belinda's more focused on making sure that she's using her nursing skills to help people that are injured in this kind of makeshift hospital area. And I think that's a good way to show what her character is like and what her priorities are, and that she really cares for other people and is a selfless person. And I think she has some other great moments in this episode, such as telling the Doctor that she can stand up for herself and giving herself up to the robots to save everybody else. That does have something to do with the Polish robot, which I couldn't go through this review without talking about. Not only is the Polish robot a fun and cute robot, but it also very cleverly sets up a few things in this episode, such as the Doctor shutting down the robot so the robots can't track them down and follow them, for Belinda to then turn the robot back on to give herself up to the robots, which for me personally I thought that's very clear that that's what she was doing, but I've seen seen a few other people with like reaction videos, and I think also my girlfriend kind of was wondering why Belinda was doing that, why she was turning the robot back on. But for me personally, it was pretty obvious that she was trying to give herself up to the robots to save everybody else. And then obviously the robot comes back again in the AI generator room to help the Doctor give the star certificate to Belinda. So like I said, not only was this robot a fun, cute addition for the story, but it does really help progress the plot in quite a natural way as well, and allow for a few things to happen in the episode in quite a natural way. As for the ending of this episode, the twist of Alan being the AI generator is a bit predictable, but it does make sense for the episode and makes good use of time travel in a very interesting way for this episode, which I appreciated. Maybe it was just predictable for me because I might have seen somebody speculating that this was going to happen before the episode aired, but I do still feel like it was pretty obvious that that's where this story was going to go. But let me know if you disagree in the comments down below. But I don't think this moment needed the whole AI generator being Al generator thing, because it kind of works without that anyway, and it also doesn't really make any sense, because what is an Al generator? RTD seems to have this thing of like anagrams or similar things to anagrams, like wordplay and stuff like that in this season, like the Sutek and Susan triad technology thing from last season. And in this case, I don't think it really makes sense and wasn't really needed for the episode, because like I said, what is an Al generator? Once that's revealed, that's kind of what that means, and then it doesn't really make sense. And it would have maybe made more sense if the big robot overlord thing was just called AI or the AI, because then it could have been revealed to just be called Al or the Al, which is still a bit weird, but works better than Al generator. And also, wouldn't the robots know that it's Al and not AI? So why are they still calling it the AI generator? It's a little bit weird, but I guess it's not like a big problem with the episode. It's not a huge issue I have. I just thought it was a little bit weird. Also, I've seen some people in some reviews and discussions about this episode talking about how this character, this machine being called the AI generator, makes the commentary of AI not very subtle and very heavy-handed, to which I would say, what commentary? There isn't any commentary on AI in this episode besides the big machine being called the AI generator. So they probably shouldn't have really called it that, because it does kind of make you think that they're going to do some commentary on AI, and then they just don't. Like, commentary on AI can't be heavy-handed if they don't do any commentary on it. So I don't understand why I've seen people saying that this is very heavy-handed commentary on AI when there isn't any commentary on AI in this episode at all, at least as far as I can tell. Also, one of my big issues with this episode, and particularly the ending of this episode, is Alan's demise, because it kind of has some sort of mixed messages of what it's trying to get across and convey in this episode. Obviously, we're led to believe and shown that Alan is a bad person, which he is. He's not a great guy. He is basically an incel, like they say, and he's a very controlling person and was a controlling boyfriend to Belinda. So we're obviously not supposed to like him. But then they bring back the every ninth word thing from the start of the episode to try and make him a more sympathetic character. So the episode's kind of giving mixed messages of whether or not we're supposed to like this guy or hate this guy, which makes it especially weird when he dies or gets turned back into a sperm and an egg and gets swept up by the polish robot, with the Doctor and Belinda kind of laughing about it and celebrating, because I guess that would kind of make sense if we're only shown that he's a bad guy and led to believe that he's a bad guy. It would still maybe feel a bit out of character for the Doctor to be celebrating that, but it would kind of make sense. But then they also try and make him a little bit sympathetic as well, so it's kind of very mixed messages, I keep saying, I guess, from the episode, to kind of show both aspects and kind of make him sympathetic, but also we're not supposed to be empathizing with him at all. It's very weird. Like I said, I think the only pacing issue I have with this episode is the cold open, which seems a little bit rushed and choppy, because I actually like how quickly the main story in this episode wraps up, because the plot isn't really the main point of this episode, and the main story wrapping up this quickly allows us to have more of this moment between the Doctor and Belinda in the TARDIS at the end of the episode, which was a scene that I really liked, and I like that we kind of slow it down a little bit for the end, and it doesn't just end so abruptly like many of the episodes last season. And although I don't like how they're drawing attention to Belinda looking like Mundy Flynn from last season, because I really don't think it needs to be a mystery, I do like that it allows for Belinda to have this great moment where she puts the Doctor in his place, with him scanning her DNA without her consent, and him just assuming she will travel with him and solve this mystery with him, which she clearly doesn't want to do. So I did like that moment between the pair, and it just gives us a good sense of Belinda's character and the new dynamic between this Doctor and companion pairing, and that there's obviously going to be a lot more conflict between them than there was with the Doctor and Ruby last season, which I really appreciate, and I'm excited to see if that sticks around for the rest of the season and they don't just immediately become best friends next episode. And obviously at the end of this episode we have a cliffhanger with the Doctor not being able to get Belinda home, which is a great mystery and a great running through line for the season. And that shot that this episode ends on is also a great cliffhanger and a very impactful moment that really gets you excited for the finale of this season and what's going on, which is something I also remember seeing in a lot of the promotional material. I think it was like the TV spots and stuff like that, and I didn't actually expect this to be in the episode itself, so it was cool to see, and like I said, it's a very impactful cliffhanger for the season as a whole. Okay, so the Robot Revolution was a decent start to the season. I definitely preferred it to Space Babies as a season opener last year, as I do think that was personally a bit of an odd episode to start the season on. However, I do think now that since the other episodes of this season has come out, this is definitely lower on the ranking compared to all of those episodes, or a lot of those episodes, but I did still prefer this to Space Babies as a season opener last year, like I said. I think it perfectly sets up Belinda as a character, even if that's something that's honestly not very well followed up on for the rest of the season, and her character does get sidelined in a lot of those later episodes, but I think she's very well set up in this. And obviously the story itself just isn't as ridiculous and difficult to get on board with as Space Babies was as a season opener last year, although Space Babies was good at setting up a lot of the things for new viewers, basically giving answers to all of the different things to Ruby as a character, which kind of happens as well mostly at the end of this episode for Belinda. But like I said, I do think I just prefer this to Space Babies, which wasn't a great episode, but it's still one of the lower episodes of this season after I've seen a lot of the other episodes. So in terms of where I'd place this, I'm mostly thinking maybe a B or C tier. I think for now I might put it on C, and then I'll see what happens in the future, what I think when I put more episodes on this tier list. But let me know where you would rank the Robot Revolution in the comments down below. Okay, so the cold open for this episode was a very typical but also great Doctor Who cold open. I love these cold opens where we get to see something that's happening before the Doctor and companion have landed, similar to what they did in the Devil's Chord as well, which was another strong opening for that episode. I also think the first third or maybe first half of this episode is incredibly well paced, especially in an era of episodes where it feels like not many of them have had time to breathe and kind of go by very quick and very rushed and almost seem like there's been too much cut out of them. But there are still some pacing issues I have with this episode, which I'll get into later on. But like I said, the first maybe third or first half of this episode I think works great. I think Belinda is once again great in this episode. I appreciate that they haven't just immediately dropped how she wants to get home, as that's obviously a big part of this season and was obviously a big part of her character and a big moment between the Doctor and Belinda at the end of the last episode. It feels natural that even though she still wants to get home, after hearing that they've landed in 1952, she still would want to go outside and have a look, because she'd obviously be interested in doing that. She wouldn't want to miss that opportunity, so I think that works really naturally. And obviously she still wants to go home after she finds out the vortex indicator has finished doing its thing, so her desire to go home is still present, which is really nice, and I'm glad they haven't just dropped that in this episode so that they can just carry on having adventures for the rest of the season. I also appreciate how this episode addressed racism. Obviously it isn't the focus of this story like something like Rosa or Dot and Bubble, but I appreciate that they still chose to acknowledge it here. And I like the moment where the Doctor and Belinda discuss this, because the Doctor almost dismisses it immediately like he's done in the past. Shakespeare Code comes to mind. But I appreciate that Belinda clearly isn't a fan of this and pushes back against it, because besides Dot and Bubble, this is still new to the Doctor, but for Belinda, she's always been a person of colour. She was born that way and has likely experienced racism for her whole life, whereas this is still kind of new to the Doctor, besides, like I said, Dot and Bubble. And obviously he's dismissed it in the past, so I guess he's kind of doing that out of habit, not really even thinking about how it affects him now as well. And it's just generally nice to see somebody pushing back against the Doctor on this, when in the past, like in the Shakespeare Code for example, he has just dismissed it with like Martha Jones and stuff like that, which did feel a little bit weird when that happened. So I appreciate that it hasn't been done again, but obviously once again it isn't the main focus of this story, but I do still appreciate that they did address it in this episode, and not even just once as well, it does come up again later on. Obviously, the big part of this episode is Mr. Ring-a-Ding, or Lux, who is obviously great in this episode. I think the design, animation, and visual effects for him look great, including the film scratch effects, him having his own soundtrack and sound effects, and the grotesque 3D version of him towards the end of the episode. Naturally, there's going to be a lot of comparisons to the Devil's Chord for this episode, which I've even drawn attention to in the intro of this video. And as much as I like Maestro a lot in the Devil's Chord, I do think Mr. Ring-a-Ding is personally better, not only as a concept, but also also with the performance. Not that I didn't think the concept and performance of Maestro wasn't also good, but I do personally prefer this here to that. Speaking of the performance of Mr. Ring-a-Ding or Lux, I think Alan Cumming was great in this role. He was a great pick, and obviously even though he's appeared in the show before, no one's really going to notice because it's just a voice role and he's got a completely different accent. But it's interesting that even though this is a voiceover role and they've cast a fairly big actor in the role, they still went for a British actor to play the role, as although Alan Cumming lives in New York, I assume at least from Doctor Who Unleashed, he is a Scottish actor and he's just putting on an American accent. So if they were to cast another big name actor, but this time an actual American, who would you have wanted to see voicing Mr. Ring-a-Ding in this episode if it weren't Alan Cumming? Let me know in the comments down below. Like I'll discuss later on in this video, I do wish we got more of Mr. Ring-a-Ding in this episode, as he does kind of take a backseat once the Doctor and Belinda get trapped inside the screen, but I do also think this was likely due to budgeting issues when it comes to animating him, as contrary to popular belief, animation is not cheap and easy. It takes a lot of time and money to do something like this, which is why they've likely never done it before, or I say likely, we do actually know that because I believe Russell has commented on that in the past, saying that this was a story he's been thinking of for a while, but they've just not been able to pull it off yet, until now obviously. Reginald Pye is also a nice addition to this episode. At first I assumed he hadn't been taken by Mr. Ring-a-Ding because he was in the projector room and either wasn't seen by Mr. Ring-a-Ding or couldn't be gotten to after barricading himself in there. But I like that we actually get more depth to his character with Mr. Ring-a-Ding or Lux, allowing him to spend time with his late wife in exchange for Reginald Pye, feeding him with films to be able to leave the cinema or at the very least stay alive. Because not only is it a nice justification to have this character here instead of just having the Doctor and Belinda, but it also is another nice use of Lux's abilities in this episode. And I also like that this comes back for the resolution of the story, which I'll get into later as well. And obviously there is that one big scene in this episode, that meta scene with the Doctor Who fans where the Doctor and Belinda come out of their TV screen and are met by Doctor Who fans in the episode. This is a scene that had been rumoured to be in this episode just before it had come out, and knowing that, I wasn't sure if it would be something that I'd like or not, or if it could be done well. But for the most part, I actually quite like this moment. If you're going to do this at any point in the show, it would be in this episode, in this moment. But with that being said, I do think it went on for a bit too long and was a little bit overly emotional for what it was. I probably would have preferred if we had focused more on the Doctor and Belinda in animated form, as that was resolved fairly quickly, but it was a nice way of giving some important exposition to Belinda. Or maybe we could have focused more on Mr. Ring-a-Ding, as like I said earlier, he does take a bit of a back seat after they get trapped in the screen. And I think it's interesting that this meta moment is the moment where the episode kind of screeches to a halt. The fact that we get a bit of a time jump to where they're sat down with a cup of tea having this conversation kind of takes it a little bit too far for me, and I think this moment could have worked a lot better as a fun gag and a fleeting moment in amongst this segment where they're trapped in the screen going through these different places like the animation and the fake reality and stuff like that. But I assume this was more likely done for budgetary reasons, like I mentioned earlier, as having more scenes with the Doctor and Belinda being animated or having more scenes with Mr. Ring-a-Ding would require more time and money spent on the animation department, which they were probably just trying to keep it within the budget by doing that. And like I said, I think this scene was too overly emotional for people who we've only just met and who are revealed to not even be real. But I also think that this moment only works because it's revealed that it's actually the fans who are fictional and not the Doctor and Belinda. I don't think this moment would work without that reveal. However, they do of course show up again for a mid-credits scene, which I think a lot of people seem to have just taken as a fun joke at the end of the episode, which it definitely was. But people were actually speculating before this episode that it would be the finale where the Doctor would be revealed to be in a TV show. And I think this mid-credits scene, along with Mrs. Flood's fourth wall-breaking appearances, are probably an indication that this is still likely to happen in the finale. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. I can understand why the resolution of this episode might feel a bit anticlimactic or unclear for some people. For me personally, I think it works, and I think it's clear that Lux's motivations haven't changed last minute, or he isn't being destroyed by the light, which it could come across that way. He's just becoming way more powerful than he was trying to be, to the point where he's spread so far across all of light in the universe that he basically has no power to do anything besides just existing. And I personally think that is a really nice resolution, which if anything maybe happens a little bit bit too quickly. Obviously, the resolution to this episode kind of isn't done by the Doctor himself, which I know a lot of people did have some issues with in previous episodes where the Doctor isn't responsible for resolving the plot, but at least in this episode he does give Belinda the hints that she needs to put that into motion and get that going. And like I hinted at earlier, it is also very well set up with the stuff with Reginald Pye's wife earlier on in the episode and her kind of convincing him to help and kind of meet her, I guess, in the afterlife or something like that. So I do think it personally does work, even if the Doctor isn't doing it himself. But I mean, he is trapped and his life force is being taken, and he does at least give Belinda the knowledge that she needs to get that done. So for me personally, I think that does still work. Mrs. Flood obviously also briefly appears at the end of this episode, and I think it's intentional that she's only here for a little bit, as well as being important that she's appearing in a different time and location to where we normally see her, as the Doctor kind of isn't really allowed to notice her yet, as I assume the big moment that's been hinted at for the end of the Interstellar Song Contest is likely going to be the Doctor recognizing and noticing Mrs. Flood and realizing that it's not right for her to be there, as so far he's only seen her as a normal human in modern day Earth as Ruby's neighbour. So I don't think we're really going to get much interaction between the Doctor and Mrs. Flood in future episodes until maybe the end of episode 6. Obviously, as I previously mentioned as well, we do have that mid-credit scene with the Doctor Who fans still existing at the end, which, like I said previously, I think is very intentional and isn't intended to only be a fun joke at the end of the episode, but along with the appearances of Mrs. Flood is likely meant to hint at some more meta elements for the finale of this season. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Okay, now we get on to looks. Similar to the second episode of last season, this is very similar to The Devil's Chord. We're in the past and we're dealing with one of these pantheon gods. This time it's to do with the god of light, and he's manifesting as a cartoon, similar to The Devil's Chord where we had a god of music. So it's a god in this kind of creative field, which leads to some very fun stuff that we can explore in this episode. And personally, I think they did it a lot better in this episode than The Devil's Chord. That's not to say that I didn't like The Devil's Chord last year, but I definitely preferred this to that episode, and I think they did a lot of interesting stuff with that in this episode, with Mr. Ring-a-Ding just being a great villain, both in the way he's written and the way that he's represented visually with the animation and special effects. But we don't really get a whole lot of him, which is probably down to obviously the budget and having to budget different animators to do all these different shots, so he does kind of disappear and take a bit of a backseat for the middle of this episode. But that does also lead to some other fun moments where we're exploring the Doctor and Belinda stuck in this cinema screen, and a fourth wall breaking moment that I'm surprised I actually quite enjoyed, where we get to see some Doctor Who fans, even if it did maybe go on for a little bit too long for me. And obviously they come back at the end of this episode, which I thought was going to also have something to do with the finale at the time, which it didn't, which was interesting, but I still don't mind that little gag at the end with the post-credits scene. So this is probably one of my favourite episodes of this season. I'm debating whether or not to put it in A or S tier at the moment. I think for now I'm going to put it in S tier and just see if that feels right to me when we put some more of these episodes in the tier list. But let me know where you would rank looks in the comments down below. Okay, so right off the bat, I'm glad they're still continuing with each episode flowing into the next episode. Obviously, this one takes place immediately after Lux. They're still in the same outfits, just like how last episode immediately took place after the Robot Revolution. I like this more serialized feel to the series, especially with it only being an 8-episode season now, which I think would have worked well for last season as well, instead of having the 6-month time jump that we got in The Devil's Chord. And we also obviously still have some references to the overarching story of this season, with mentions of Earth and the other characters who should know what Earth is, having never heard of it. But the big question I have about this cold open is, how did they happen to get changed into the exact same spacesuits that everybody else had? Even down to the helmets automatically sealing so that they are protected, and having those kind of propulsion systems in that stop them or help them land when they're landing on the surface. So spoilers for the rest of this review, but this is probably my main issue with this episode because it did really take me out of the episode. Maybe this could have been a good excuse to bring back the orange spacesuits, because then every modern Doctor besides 9 would have worn it, and it wouldn't have taken me out of the episode as much as it did. But like I said, that's like the main issue I have with this episode, and it is kind of a nitpick, although it did take me out of the episode when it happened. And technically we do still get a return of the orange spacesuits, because they have a repainted helmet from the orange spacesuit at the end of the episode that Alice is wearing when she's leaving this colony mine. Also, the placement of the titles felt a bit off and abrupt to me. I can't really explain why, it just felt a bit sudden and out of place, but I suppose there isn't really anywhere else else they could have put the titles in this episode, unless maybe they saved it for the reveal in the middle of the episode, which would have been a very interesting idea, but it probably would have worked even less, as the rest of the episode would have felt like it wrapped up a bit too quick if they did that. So I suppose there wasn't really anywhere else they could have put the titles, but the placement of it did seem a bit weird to me. Obviously, Varada Sethu is still great as Belinda in this episode. I've been really enjoying her as a character so far. I think she's a great companion. We obviously get more of her wanting to get home, but now trusting the Doctor more, as well as more mentions of her parents back home, which we got last episode as well. And this episode is a great chance to show Belinda's nursing skills, but there is a moment where the Doctor diagnoses someone instead of her doing it, which I thought was a little bit odd. I also think this is a great opening to the episode. It starts as just a mysterious horror base under siege episode, kind of like the Alien movies or The Thing or something like that. And if the reveal of this episode hadn't been leaked, that would have made the reveal feel even more shocking, as this episode would have maybe seemed more by the numbers than it actually was. Rose Ayling-Ellis was a great supporting character in this episode as Alice Fenley, and we also have the whole thing of Alice being deaf and using sign language and subtitles, which I thought was a fun inclusion to this episode. I think this was a good addition to the story and a great bit of inclusivity, as it doesn't feel like Alice being deaf is the focus of the story. Alice just happens to be deaf, and it still affects the story by making everything more difficult to deal with, but it isn't the focus of the story, which I really appreciated. And obviously, the Midnight Entity returns in this episode, and even though I was 90% sure this was going to be a sequel to Midnight before watching it because it leaked before, that reveal still really worked for me personally. I thought it was done really well, and it was giving me similar vibes to when I first watched The Legend of Ruby Sunday and they had the Sutekh twist at the end, which obviously Empire of Death didn't quite land for me as much, but that initial reveal at the end of Legend of Ruby Sunday really worked for me, and this was very similar in this episode. Now, I was worried about the Midnight Entity returning. My original speculation from that last shot of the Next Time trailer we got last week made me think that we were going to see the Midnight Entity doing the same thing again, because that shot looked very similar to when the 10th Doctor was possessed by the Midnight Entity in Midnight. So I was worried that the Midnight Entity would just act the same as before, just in a different location, but luckily they did something different with it in this episode. Likely because, at least from what RTD suggests in Unleashed, this wasn't originally intended to be a Midnight sequel when it was first written. It seems like originally this episode was likely written as a completely original monster by Sharma Angel Warfall, but then RTD realised it could suit the Midnight Entity and rewrote some of the parts for it to fit that, hence why he has a co-writing credit in this instead of it just being written by him or just being written by Sharma Angel Warfall. Although that does make me think how much of this was written by Russell, because I would have assumed that this episode was mostly written by Sharma and that Russell just came in to add some of the Midnight stuff, but I do believe he had top billing for writing credits in this episode, so maybe he ended up rewriting most of the story. I'm not really sure. But personally, I think this still works for me, as it fits with what the Midnight Entity would do, but it's just messing with them in a different way to what it did before. I'm glad they also didn't show us what it looked like or reveal too much about it. Obviously, if you pause it at the right moments, or if you watched Unleashed, you can basically see what the Midnight Entity does look like in this episode. But for the episode itself, it does really work. And like Russell said in Unleashed, if you're going to do a sequel to any story, it shouldn't be Midnight, because you could easily mess it up and taint the original story, like they did with Pyramids of Mars last year. But luckily, I think they did this really well and pulled it off. Also, unless I'm understanding the mechanics wrong, there is a moment where Alice does a full 360 when she's saying "I'm clean" to the rest of the troopers, which I would have thought would have killed everyone following the rules of this monster. But like I say, maybe I'm misunderstanding the mechanics of this monster. Maybe she has to stand still for a little bit for it to work, or maybe it was just an in-the-moment acting decision that they didn't really pick up on. Also, the line "if it was a clock face, you die at midnight" was a little bit too on the nose for me personally, but I know it worked for a lot of people. At first, I was a little bit confused about how they resolved the plot with the Midnight Entity. I didn't quite understand how looking at itself defeated it, but on second watch, I did hear the line, "if the thing behind it is destroyed, what if the thing behind it is itself?" And so that did kind of work for me when I realised what they were getting at and what they were trying to do, but at first I thought that it was just the creature looking at itself, and that somehow defeated it. So on first watch, it didn't quite work for me, but like I say, I kind of understood it after the second time. I also like how this was set up earlier on in the episode with how good of a shot Shaya is, or Shaya, I can't remember exactly how you say her name, which also comes back later on in the episode when the Midnight Entity possesses Belinda. And I also think them having to wait for the airlock and someone getting possessed is very well set up by the fact that when they first arrive, it's established that the airlock can only fit in 6 people at a time. And the Midnight Entity possessing Belinda at the end of this story was a nice twist that doesn't really last for very long, but I think it still works. And Shaya sacrificing herself to save them is also a very nice moment. This is probably my my least favourite Mrs. Flood cameo in this season so far, because if an older woman showing up in every episode isn't already similar enough to last year's Susan Triad mystery, this particular instance of it immediately made me think of Susan Triad showing up on the monitor in Space Babies. And it also just feels very different to previous Mrs. Flood cameos, but maybe this will make sense when we find out who she really is. So let me know your thoughts on who you think Mrs. Flood might be in the comments down below. Personally, I think this episode could have ended with the zooming out shot of the Doctor and Belinda in the TARDIS when they're lying on the TARDIS floor, but then I suppose we wouldn't have had the tease of the Midnight Entity surviving and the Mrs. Flood cameo at the end, which they seem to be trying to make sure is in every episode for this season. I just personally think it would have been a better emotional moment to end this episode on, especially considering this episode seems to be overrunning a little bit in comparison to the other episodes this season, with this episode being around 48 minutes long and the rest of them being around 45 minutes or less. Okay, so The Well was a surprisingly good episode. To say that it was a sequel to an episode that I don't think ever should have got a sequel, but luckily I think they went about it the right way. They didn't reveal too much, and they did something different with the Midnight Entity, which I really appreciated. It's obviously doing different things to Midnight. I know a lot of people were upset that the paranoia and fighting between these characters isn't really on the same level as Midnight, and for me personally I think that works because they're not trying to do the same thing again as Midnight, it's just on the same planet with the same entity. And it also leaves a few things up in the air at the end of this episode, which leave a lot of people speculating and wondering if this plan actually worked, if they actually got out of there kind of unscathed, which I think is very interesting. Right now I'm thinking of putting this again at either A or S tier. I don't know personally whether I prefer it to Lux or not. I think for now my gut's kind of telling me to put it at A tier, but I don't think I really have any issues with this episode, so I don't know if I should put it below Lux or not. Maybe it should be S tier, and then maybe because that fan scene in Lux goes on for a little bit too long, I might move that down to A tier, but I'm not really sure how I feel about that. But let me know where you would rank The Well in the comments down below. So to begin with, it's good that even though this episode is a bit of a detour from the main story of this season, we still start with the Doctor and Belinda trying to land in May 2025 and getting a reading on the Vindicator in a way that also feeds into the main plot of this episode. So even though this episode is a bit of a detour, it still works in a more serialized approach that this season is going for, especially with Conrad likely returning in the finale as well. I've seen a lot of people compare this episode to Love and Monsters from Series 2, even calling this Love and Monsters 2. And while I was getting that vibe from the start of this episode, it really is only the first sort of 15 minutes or so of this episode that is giving that vibe. The rest of this episode isn't really anything like Love and Monsters, besides it being a Dr. Light story. We obviously get a flashback to an adventure with the Doctor and Ruby from Season 1. I had initially thought that this moment was maybe going to have an Autons cameo, thanks to the promotional images being released with the shop window dummies in the background, the filming location being the same as Henrik's from Rose, and me thinking that the antidote that the Doctor was holding could potentially be anti-plastic. But the closer we got to this episode, the more I realised that probably wasn't going to be the case, especially once we got the Next Time trailer for this episode. However, I believe the director of this episode, Peter Hall, or maybe it was Pete McTighe himself, I can't remember, did confirm in Unleashed that this was an intentional nod to the episode Rose, even if the Autons themselves didn't return. So it's nice that on the 20th anniversary of Doctor Who returning, the revival of Doctor Who, we did get a little nod to the first ever episode in this year's season, even if it wasn't the Autons themselves returning. But seeing those shop window dummies in the background did really make me want to see the Autons look like that if they returned in the future. And we also got confirmation that this happened immediately after the Devil's Chord, and weirdly not in that 6-month time jump we got between Space Babies and the Devil's Chord last year, which is where I expected this to be. Although I liked Ruby last year, I think since we've had Belinda this season, I've kind of realised how uninteresting she was as a companion last year. The Doctor and Ruby were just friends going on different adventures with no conflict or character development, as it happens off-screen in that 6-month time jump. Whereas Belinda and the Doctor have a lot more conflict this season, with Belinda wanting to get home and not necessarily trusting the Doctor, and the Doctor just wanting to go on adventures with her and assuming she'll want to come along for the ride. But with all that being said, I think Ruby was great in this episode. It's more interesting to see her on her own dealing with the aftermath of travelling with the Doctor, rather than just seeing her travelling with the Doctor as best friends. I'm also glad we got to see the return of the Sundays in this episode, including Ruby's birth mother Louise Miller, and especially especially Cherry Sunday, who is always the highlight of any episode that she's in, and I particularly enjoyed her moments in this episode. And obviously a big part of this episode is Ruby's new relationship with Conrad Clark, who she met on his podcast Lucky Day. I also really liked the scene where Ruby was explaining the shriek to Conrad when they were in the cafe together, where we get a glimpse of what it would look like when Ruby is telling this story about what the shriek does. I'm not sure whether this was in the script, it probably was, but if not, I want to give props to the director Peter Hall. Either way, even if this wasn't part of the script or was his idea, because either way it was directed phenomenally and was a great moment in this episode. But unsurprisingly, to me at least, Conrad isn't who he seems, and was actually just getting close to Ruby for his own gain. That's not to say the twist didn't work for me, but I definitely knew he wasn't to be trusted from the start of this episode. And I think a lot of people have been slightly misunderstanding this character a little bit. I've seen a lot of people wondering how, after all the stuff that he's seen from the shriek, the Doctor and Ruby, evidence of the Doctor being able to time travel as a child, with all that evidence, how he still doesn't seem to believe any of this is real. And that's kind of the point. He knows this stuff is real. He's seen it. He's just lying. Like the right-wing grifters and even politicians that I assume this character is meant to be based on, they know the stuff they're saying isn't true, but they're saying it to further their own agenda or line their pockets. Conrad knows aliens, the Doctor, the work at UNIT is all real, but he has an agenda to push and money to make. He's doing this just as a grift to make money. And this is made even more clear when he belittles Shirley, saying that she's living off benefits and saying that UNIT are wasting taxpayer money when he himself is proven to be dodging paying tax. And like he says to the Doctor at the end of this episode, I don't accept your reality, I reject it. Something that you'd hear a lot of right-wing grifters saying when they're told what they're saying is untrue, but they already know that and can't refute it, so all they can do is say that they don't accept the reality of the situation. So that's my personal view on Conrad in this episode. He knows all this stuff is true and the stuff that he's saying are all lies, but he doesn't care. That's just what he's doing. He's spreading misinformation so that he can make money because he's a grifter. Obviously, this episode ends with Conrad breaking into UNIT and holding them at gunpoint, trying to force them to admit that none of this is real. And he does this by using an inside man at UNIT, which I'd very quickly clocked on to being Jordan Lang, the new UNIT analyst, as he was introduced in this episode and was seen listening to the podcast at the start of the episode. It could have maybe been cool if they somehow introduced him earlier on so it wasn't as obvious that he was the inside man, but they probably didn't have all this fully ready when they were filming season 1, so they probably couldn't have put him in there. And this was the first time we'd seen UNIT in season 2, so there wasn't really any opportunity to do that, I guess. But it still could have been cool if there was some way they could have introduced this character earlier on to make it less obvious that he was going to be the inside man later on. And of course, Conrad shoots Jordan to get into UNIT, and when Kate points this out to Conrad and his audience, he once again lies, claiming that maybe UNIT shot him, or maybe he's an actor, when he obviously knows this isn't true, which is backing up what I was saying about Conrad earlier on. We of course also get a lot more of Kate Stewart in this particular episode, and although I've always liked Kate Stewart as a character, probably mostly due to Gemma Redgrave's performance, she's never really felt like much of a character in the past, and I think she's gradually been improving since she was reintroduced in the RTD2 era, but I think this episode is probably the best showing of Kate Stewart in Doctor Who that we've had so far. As satisfying as it is to see the shriek set free on Conrad, and as obvious as it was that it was coming given that he hadn't taken the antidote, did Kate Stewart maybe go a little bit too far with this choice? Yeah, she definitely did, but from what Pete McTighe has said about this moment in the behind the scenes,
and it's the beginning of a story that has repercussions beyond this episode, beyond this season, even beyond this show.
This is something that's going to be addressed in the future and is likely going to feed into the spin-off he is co-writing with Russell, The War Between the Land and the Sea, so it'll be interesting to see that in the future. And backing up what I was saying about Conrad earlier on, even though he is almost killed by the shriek at the end of this episode, he still says, at least your special effects have improved, when he knows he's safe. And this isn't because even after seeing the real shriek and almost being killed by it, he still doesn't believe that it's real. It's because he knows the cameras are still on him, and all of this is being live streamed to his audience. Conrad knows the shriek are real, he knows UNIT are real. He was genuinely scared for his life when the shriek was about to eat him, and genuinely thankful that Ruby saved him. But that wouldn't fit his agenda he's been trying to get across this whole time, so once he thinks he's safe after the shriek has been tased, and he realises the cameras are still on him, he has to keep playing up to them for his audience. At least, once again, that's just my interpretation of this anyway, and of Conrad's character character in this episode. I know as well a lot of people have issues with how the public does a full 180 after the live stream and the incident at Unit, where the public basically is once again in full support of Unit and doesn't support Conrad anymore because it doesn't seem very realistic, and with what Conrad's supporters are probably like, they would still probably support him even if his lies have been exposed to the public and shown to be untrue. And while I agree with this, and it is a little bit weird that the public does a 180 and supports Unit again, with Conrad likely returning for the finale, I do think we are going to see more of this developed and shown during the finale, where we're probably going to see that Conrad does still have some supporters out there and are going to play a big part in the finale, in my opinion. That's just my speculation on what could happen with Conrad returning in the finale, if that does happen, which I think it will. And of course, this episode also ends with a confrontation between the Doctor and Conrad, with the Doctor giving Conrad a good talking to at the end of this episode. And I love this scene so much because I love how we get to see more of this darker side of Ncuti's Doctor. And I also love the lighting in this scene. I wish we saw the TARDIS lit like this more often instead of the boring white lighting that we get most of the time we see the TARDIS interior in this season and last season. And I also doubt that Pete McTighe and Russell T Davies realised how relevant some of these lines in this scene would be to this exact week that the episode aired in, because a lot of these lines just hit so hard in this particular week, which must have been a coincidence with how early this was filmed and written. And of course, like always, we get a Mrs. Flood cameo to end this episode. This for me personally is one of the better Mrs. Flood cameos this season, because it feels like it's actually further in the plot by her setting Conrad free, assumedly for the finale, unlike last week where she just showed up because she has to show up every week. But I do hate that this keeps happening at the end of every episode, because it's becoming very predictable and feels very tacked on to each episode. Because as soon as you get to the end of the episode and you see someone like in a silhouette, or you see their feet walking towards Conrad in this case, or you see the back of someone's head or something like that, you are immediately like, oh well, it's going to be Mrs. Flood, isn't it? Because we know she's got to show up in every episode. So like I said, because of that, it is just becoming very predictable and feels very tacked on to the end of each of these episodes, and would maybe feel a bit better if she just randomly showed up like in the middle of an episode or something like that, kind of like she did with the Robot Revolution. Even though that was obviously the start of the episode, it at least felt different to her showing up in literally like the last 2 minutes of the episode every time. Now, Russell has indicated that episode 6 is one of the episodes that we need to watch straight away without having it spoiled for us, and so I'm assuming and hoping that that is when we'll find out who Mrs. Flood is at the end of that episode, because if not, it's going to get very frustrating just seeing her show up at the end of every episode and not really doing anything besides showing up for a cameo in the last couple of minutes. So I'm hoping that it is the end of episode 6 that we find out who she is, because if we have to wait for the end of the first part of the finale or at some point in the very last episode, it's going to be very frustrating just seeing her for a couple of minutes just for a cameo. But I'm assuming that's the case. I feel like the end of episode 6, the Doctor's going to notice her and he's going to be kind of wondering how she's at this Interstellar Song Contest in the future in outer space, and that's for some reason going to lead her to reveal who she is to the Doctor and set up the finale. But let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. Okay, so Lucky Day is probably one of my favourite episodes of this season. It's the only Doctor Light episode in this season, and it's also Companion Light in a way because we've got Belinda. Obviously we've got Ruby as well, who is a companion, but she's not the companion of this season. And it does some really interesting stuff with Conrad in this episode, where he's basically one of these kind of right-wing grifters who's just going out spreading lies and misinformation, even though he knows those things aren't true, and he's shown that those things definitely aren't true. I know some people took that a little bit of a different way when watching the episode, but for me personally, it's clear that he knows all these things that he's seeing or lying about. He knows they're true, but he doesn't care because he's just there to spread misinformation, and I personally think it's done really well in that, and also sets up his character well for the finale as well. Right now, I think I feel like putting this at A tier, but it could potentially go up to S tier. I probably prefer it more than Lux though, so I might just flip these ones around just to show that I prefer it a little bit more to Lux. Okay, so this episode opens with Omo telling the story of him meeting the Doctor in the past, which gives us a sense of this connection that Omo and the Doctor already have, and you can get a better sense of that if you read the prequel story written by Anua Ellams, which I read before watching this episode, and it just gives a stronger connection between the Doctor and Omo and how come they already know each other before this episode starts. So if you've not read that yet, I definitely recommend reading it, even if you've obviously already seen the episode, which I assume you will have done before watching this video. We're also obviously still continuing this season's story of trying to get Belinda home, with the Doctor choosing Lagos, Nigeria due to its large communications network. And even though Belinda still wants to get home, it makes sense that she's happy for the Doctor to stay here for a while, given that it's clear how much this place, particularly Omo's Palace, means to the Doctor since regenerating into this new body. Unfortunately though, this does mean we don't get much of Belinda in this episode, as she understandably wants to let the Doctor have this time on his own. But Belinda's absence is definitely felt in this episode, particularly given that we didn't get much of her or even the Doctor last episode. Obviously, like I mentioned, the setting of this episode is Lagos, Nigeria, and it's particularly set in a barbershop due to the importance of storytelling in this particular establishment in this culture, which I think was a really nice focus of this episode. I also appreciate that when the Doctor tells his story, he doesn't tell an exciting adventure that we haven't seen before, which they could have easily done just as an excuse for like a Dalek cameo or something like that, but instead he tells a human story about Belinda, which is nice because of how little we see of her in this episode, like I mentioned, but it also gives us a nice Mrs. Flood cameo for this episode, which is a lot better and less forced than in previous episodes, where she just kept showing up for the last couple of minutes. Instead, this is just like a fleeting moment where she's walking past Belinda, who obviously already knows who she is, as she's apparently going to collect some pills from the doctors or from the hospital. Obviously, one of the big characters in this episode is the barber, and it's clear that they probably expected the audience to assume that he was going to be the Anansi, or that the Anansi was going to make an appearance at some point in this episode, because I remember when we saw the spider in the trailer, we were thinking the spider might be the Anansi, and I think as it was getting closer to this episode, we did think that maybe he could be the Anansi instead. But obviously, they were clearly expecting us to assume that already, and still, after it's revealed that he isn't the Anansi, I did almost expect more of a reveal of who he would actually be, such as like a Time Lord with his name being the barber or something along those lines. But I'm also glad they didn't do that, because I don't think that would have really worked with this episode. So it's revealed that the barber isn't actually any of these gods that he claimed to be. He was just responsible for passing on their stories and legends using the Nexus, which then became self-sustaining, meaning the gods didn't have any need for him anymore. So he's obviously angry at the gods for not giving him credit for his work and just kind of casting him out, and therefore his whole plan is to try and cut them off by, I think, ascending to the throne, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Now, this moment is probably my least favourite part of the episode, not because I think that the reveal or his true identity isn't a good one, but because in an episode that is already very exposition heavy, within the space of about 5 minutes, we get the reveal that the barber is the god known as Anansi or Loki, etc. He's the personification of these gods. Then we get the reveal that he actually isn't the personification of these gods. Then we get the reveal of the barber's true identity, and then we get the reveal of Abby's true identity. And like I said, that happens all in the space of about 5 minutes, so it just feels very exposition heavy and a little bit rushed. Obviously, from the very beginning of the episode, it's shown that the Doctor recognises this woman that's in the barbershop, Abby, but isn't sure at first why he recognises her. So this is then revealed that it's because he previously met her as the fugitive Doctor, which of course he doesn't really have any memories of, but that does kind of beg the question how he does eventually remember her. I guess just seeing her brought back that particular memory or something like that, but he does also have a memory of purposely losing a bet to Anansi so that he didn't have to marry Anansi's daughter, who this is, which I assume also obviously happened whilst he was the fugitive Doctor. So although her cameo does feel a bit random and brings up those questions, it does actually make sense for her to be in this particular episode, in my opinion, as it would be wrong to mention at the start of this episode that this is the first time the Doctor has been black without mentioning that they have been black before, albeit in an incarnation that they have little to no memory of. Although this, I can imagine, would be confusing for new viewers who have just been told that 15 is the first black Doctor at the start of this episode. Although with that being said, he does say it's his first time in this black body, not his first time being black in general. So before all this, Belinda returns after running through the market with a cameo from Inua Ellams, which was a nice moment, but it felt a little bit out of place from the rest of the episode. But I guess it was nice to be somewhere else besides the barbershop for a bit of the episode. After the reveal I mentioned earlier, Belinda gives some words of wisdom to Abby.
Hurt people hurt people.
Oh, that's nice. I always say make people cry, but yours includes the people who don't want to give you the satisfaction.
leading to Abby giving the Doctor a map to the engine room through braids in his hair, which is a nice way to show some African culture and history with the origins of braids during slavery, which I'm sure a lot of people weren't aware of, so that's a nice little kind of history lesson in this episode to teach some viewers about other cultures, if that's something they weren't already aware of. And obviously the Doctor and Belinda get into the engine room and start destroying some of the engine so that the Doctor can overload the engine with his stories about his life and experience and knowledge, which is a very common ending for Doctor Who, with flashbacks from his previous lives and adventures. However, I think it works well for this particular episode, given its focus on stories and storytelling. I think it just works well for the themes of this episode this time, whereas he's done this before in episodes that aren't really about that. And it's also quite a meta moment due to the show being almost never ending and always being able to continue and tell new stories, particularly with the Doctor's 6-word story, I'm born, I die, I'm born, which is just very reminiscent of the show as a whole. And we also get a weird little cameo with that child that Belinda sees being the same actor who played Captain Poppy in Space Babies, and also being credited as Poppy in this episode. Obviously, this could be due to the Doctor's explanation of this particular moment with the stories leaking through. I guess we can assume when the Doctor was connected to the engine, it kind of obviously already had all his stories connected to it as well, and this could be a bit of Space Babies leaking through into the real world, or this could be something hinting at the finale, which I've heard a lot of people speculating it could be. So let me know what you think that's about in the comments down below. Okay, so the story in the engine is a great episode this season, and I did really like it, especially the more I think about it. But I think when I first watched it, it didn't quite live up to my expectations because I was expecting a little bit more from it. But with that being said, I do still think I really like this episode, and it is one of the best of the season. So I think for that reason, I'm also going to put this in A tier, but I'll put it kind of right at the bottom of A tier for now. So once again, this episode opens with us continuing the story of the Doctor trying to get Belinda home, which is nice that we're still continuing the story. However, this time it's thankfully progressed a little bit, as we now know the Vindicator is ready to get them home. And we also have Mrs. Flood watching and having an interest in the Vindicator. And with this episode, like many of the other episodes this season, it still makes sense that Belinda wants to stick around for a bit, even if the Vindicator is finished doing its thing this time, given that she's clearly a fan of Eurovision and wants to stay to watch the song contest. But obviously, this doesn't all go to plan, as Kid breaks into the gallery to take over the song contest, blowing up the arena, leading to everyone being flung into space, including the Doctor, which gives us some great and dark visuals for this episode, which makes sense because this is apparently the most expensive episode of Doctor Who, and the visuals really demonstrate that and work really well. This leads to the Doctor having visions of Susan to push him to survive and get out of the situation using a confetti cannon, and I think this was a really nice moment and a good way to have a cameo from Carol Ann Ford as Susan in this episode. I'm assuming that this means that Susan is probably going to return for some reason in the finale, otherwise I don't see why they would have shown this. But either way, I think it is also a bit weird, because if she isn't showing up in the finale, then it does seem a little bit random that they would tease us with this if she isn't going to show up. And even if she is, it does seem weird that they would tease this late into the season. Obviously she was mentioned a lot in season 1 as well, but if she's going to be in the finale of this season, you'd think there would have been more mentions of her besides this moment right before the finale. But this does also have me worried as well, because one of the Susan cameos shows up when we're focused on Belinda, which makes me worry that we're going to have some weird twist with Belinda related to Susan, like she's going to be some bi-generated Susan or something weird like that, which I really hope they don't do, because I just want Belinda to be a normal companion and just be Belinda, because I like her as she is. Obviously, like I mentioned, the Doctor escapes being trapped in space by using the confetti cannon, meeting some great side characters for this episode in Mike and Gary. And I have to say, I haven't personally seen anyone else say this, so it might just be me, but when Mike, who is of course medically trained, is treating the Doctor, he's giving Doctor vibes to me. And so if they're looking back at actors who have already appeared in the show to play the Doctor in the future, like they've done in the past with like Peter Capaldi and stuff, I definitely think he could be a good choice, but that might just be me. Let me know what you think about that in the comments down below. And this is unfortunately where the positives of this episode end for me, because this episode obviously towards the end has a confrontation between the Doctor and Kid, and although what Kid is doing is wrong, making him out to be a purely bad guy just feels very off to me. Kid has some very justifiable reasons for what he's doing, even if he is going about it the wrong way. At the end of the day, he is a freedom fighter who's survived a genocide. Especially with the Doctor's backstory, you'd expect him to sympathize with Kid in some way, instead of saying the things that he says in this episode to him. I understand that the Doctor doesn't necessarily know Kid's backstory at this point, as only Belinda has been told about it by Cora, and the Doctor likely only finds out about all this when watching Cora perform her song. And while I understand that we're not supposed to like the Doctor in this moment, and I do like seeing this Doctor in his darker moments, the optics of having a character who is a genocide survivor being played by an actor who is also a genocide survivor torturing another survivor of genocide does just feel wrong to me. And I also don't know how much of this episode is meant to be an allegory for the current situation with Eurovision and its relationship to Israel and Palestine, given when this episode was likely written, but if it is meant to be commenting on that, I think it goes about it the wrong way and gets the wrong message across. With that being said, I think the way that they save everybody from the song contest is well set up with the holograms at the beginning of the episode where we see Graham Norton's hologram, even if it may be a little bit of a stretch that technology and people who work on holograms are able to set up a tractor beam with it. Similarly, I think the way that they bring everybody back to life using the cryogenic freezing or reversing the cryogenic freezing process is also well set up with having Rylan in this episode. It isn't just there for a cameo. Him being cryogenically frozen and being brought back to host this song contest is kind of set up for how they save the people at the end of this episode. But similarly to the negatives that I was just talking about, we don't get any kind of comeuppance or dealing with the corporation and what the corporation has done at the end of this episode. Cora just kind of sings her song and moves on, and we don't really get to see the Doctor dealing with the corporation or dismantling the corporation or anything like that, which I think is really unfortunate. Obviously, we then get a return of the Graham Norton hologram to give us the exposition about what's happened to the Earth, setting up the finale, and we end on a great cliffhanger of the TARDIS doors exploding. But obviously, that isn't where this episode ends. Obviously, this episode ends with the reveal that Mrs. Flood is in fact the Rani, as she bigenerates into a new Rani, or with a new Rani bigenerating from her, which I just personally felt like was a very boring and underwhelming reveal, not only because people had already been speculating that this was going to be the Rani and that it seemed like a very obvious choice, but just by the way that it was done in the episode. I feel like this was meant to be this season's equivalent of the Master reveal in Utopia, and I just think it comes across nowhere near anything quite as impactful as that reveal. Obviously, not every reveal has to be as huge and impactful as that, and we might get a bigger reveal at the end of the first part of the finale, but this just felt like a very underwhelming and tacked on moment in the episode when compared to that reveal, which was a big part of the main episode with a significant amount more build up to it and not just a tacked on post-credit scene. And the Doctor and Belinda aren't even there to witness it. But with that being said, I will say that I do like the theme that we get from Murray Gold for the Rani. Like I said, I don't necessarily mind the reveal that Mrs. Flood is the Rani. I think it's just the way that it was handled in this episode, and I think the double acts between these two Ranis, or the Rani and Mrs. Flood, could be very interesting for the finale. But it does also feel a bit weird considering bigeneration is meant to be so rare, and before the Doctor bigenerated, it was meant to just be a myth. And unfortunately, there was also just no progression of Mrs. Flood throughout this season to make it anywhere near interesting when it was revealed who she actually was. She was just showing up at the end of every episode, or maybe briefly in the middle of an episode. The only thing she really did was set Conrad free, which is obviously going to play a part in the finale, and showing an interest in the Vindicator. So like I said, I just think the reveal itself was very boring and underwhelming. Okay, so the Interstellar Song Contest was an episode that I wasn't really all that excited for, because like I said, Eurovision just isn't really my thing. I've never watched it. I've never been interested in it. So for the first kind of half of this episode, I was actually quite enjoying it and having a good time because I was quite surprised by it, probably because I went in with such low expectations. But then we get to the end of this episode and I just think the messaging and the political aspects of this episode are really muddled at the end. And I just think the moment with the Doctor torturing Kid is incredibly out of character. And I think if they were trying to relate this to current issues that people are having with Eurovision, I just don't think they got the right message across. And I really hate the fact that the corporation in this isn't dealt with at all. Cora just kind of sings her song and we move on. So that ending of this episode just really lets this down for me. And obviously we also get the Mrs. Flood Rani reveal at the end of this episode, which was just incredibly underwhelming as well. Obviously now in hindsight, it's probably because we were going to have the whole reveal of Omega at the end of the next episode and stuff like that. But obviously that doesn't really go anywhere either for me personally. So the ending of this episode really lets it down. And we set up Susan in this episode, which doesn't go anywhere as well, which I assume it was probably meant to until everything was reshot for the finale. So I think for that reason, I'm going to put this at C tier for now, because like I said, I enjoyed the first half of this episode. And I think for that reason as well, I'm probably going to move the Robot Revolution up to B tier, just because it's definitely better than the Interstellar Song Contest. So to begin with, for this cold open, I was initially confused seeing the Rani using magic at the start of this episode, given that she's meant to be a scientist, but I do think this is explained well later on in the episode with the baby being the god of wishes, and that's how the Rani is getting her magical abilities, because this baby is the 7th son of the 7th son of the 7th son, which is obviously 777, which is a lucky number, and means that this baby is apparently Desiderium, the god of wishes, so another member of the Pantheon. And in this cold opening as well, we do get a fun ending to the cold open with the Doctor, or John Smith, and Belinda waking up as a married couple with a daughter, which is a nice lead-in to the titles of this episode. Obviously, along with Conrad appearing on the TV screen and returning from Lucky Day. I think it's a lot of fun having this episode take place in this alternate reality, Conrad's wish world, and it leads to a lot of the episode feeling very inspired by things like WandaVision and even Barbie, mostly with the cold open with John Smith and Belinda waking up, but that could also just be because Ncuti Gatwa is in this. And there's obviously a lot of kind of similar things to 1984 in this as well, by George Orwell. Obviously, this reality that Conrad has wished into existence is very inspired by the kind of 1950s nuclear family type vibe, which we see with a lot of the characters and what they're doing in their day-to-day life, and even some of the set design and visuals in this episode. We've obviously got the Doctor, or John Smith, and his wife Belinda, and their one child, with John Smith being the one to go out to work and Belinda staying at home and looking after the child and the house, which obviously fits the traditional kind of 1950s family and the nuclear family dynamic, which obviously is something that Conrad is going to want to be a thing, or believes is the right thing to be. I guess this isn't technically a proper nuclear family with John Smith and Belinda only having one child. The traditional nuclear family is usually like a husband and wife and a daughter and a son, but if I want to dust off some of my sociology degree, Murdoch 1949 describes the family as a social group characterized by common residence, economic cooperation and reproduction. It includes adults of both sexes, at least 2 of whom maintain a socially approved sexual relationship, and 1 or more children, owned or adopted, of the sexually cohabiting adults, which is obviously what this episode is trying to go for and what Conrad believes is right, and definitely matches Conrad's views in Lucky Day. And I particularly like the moment in Unit where the Doctor, or John Smith, calls Ibrahim a beautiful man, and that obviously leads to Ibrahim having some issues with that and saying that you can't find another man beautiful, because this is obviously that 1950s stereotypical dynamic where homosexuality isn't really accepted. I think the slips are also a fun detail to show how important doubt is in this story and how there's something wrong with this reality. And similarly, we also have the Bone Beast, which are a very interesting visual in this episode, even if they aren't really doing anything and we don't really know why they're here, besides maybe to encourage doubt, as obviously that's what they actually want in the end. However, Russell T Davies has stated that they will be explained in the next episode. But personally, this is probably my main issue with this episode, is I just wish we had more time with this fake reality world. Instead of cutting back to the Rani, Mrs. Flood and Conrad in the Bone Palace, I kind of wish we were just kind of dropped into this fake reality with the Doctor, or John Smith, and Belinda at the start of this episode, and we were kind of left trying to figure it out all throughout the episode until it gets revealed at the end. But obviously instead we have the cold open with the Rani, which kind of explains roughly what's going on, and we keep cutting back to the Rani and Mrs. Flood and Conrad in the Bone Palace, which gives us more of an explanation as to what is going on instead of just finding out alongside the main characters in this episode. And it also just means we don't get to see as much of this fake reality as I would have loved to see in this episode. Obviously, another big part of this episode is the dispossessed, which are the people that Conrad doesn't really think about, and so they don't really exist in his reality. They can kind of do whatever they want because he isn't really thinking about them. This is something that I actually knew was going to be in the episode before it aired, as obviously some of you may know Tharies appeared in this scene as an extra, and I actually edited his video talking about this episode and appearing on the show, which we did before the episode actually aired so that it could be ready on time. So this is something I actually knew about the episode, but it still was a great detail and really shows a flaw in Conrad's wish world, as people he doesn't think about are forgotten and able to tell that something is wrong with this reality and are trying to do something about it. And of course this is also very well set up in Lucky Day with his comments about Shirley that he makes in that episode. We also have the 2 Ranis, with Archie Panjabi as the new Rani, who I think is great in this episode. She's really channeling Kate O'Mara with her campness, and I'm glad glad they actually get around to showing her being a scientist and doing experiments in this episode, with her whole plan being a science experiment to break apart reality and reveal the Underverse, instead of just having her be a female version of the Master, basically, even if she does do some similar things in this episode, such as the dance sequence. And I think having the dynamic of both the Rani and Mrs. Flood is a fun one, but I'd be interested to see what they do with this in the next episode, and if they justify having another bi-generation so soon after it was first introduced, which apparently we are going to get an explanation about bi-generation next episode, if RTD is telling the truth. Okay, so towards the end of this episode, we get a green screen cameo from Rogue, which doesn't look all that great, but it is nice to see Rogue again and have some kind of follow-up from the episode Rogue last season. Unfortunately, I don't think we're really going to get more than we got here, unless 15 does continue into the next season and we get an episode of him trying to save him, but I don't know how likely that will be. It does also feel a little bit weird that Rogue knows all this stuff and is able to communicate to the Doctor in this fake reality, but it was still nice to see him, bad visual effects aside. And obviously, Rogue tells the Doctor that tables don't do that, referring to the slips in this episode, which leads to the Doctor, or I guess John Smith in this case, having doubts about this reality, leading to Belinda calling the police on him and getting him taken away to the Bone Palace, where we then get the Rani reveal to the Doctor or John Smith and Belinda, which obviously is unfortunate because we already knew this because of the disappointing and underwhelming post-credit scene reveal last episode. But even if not for that, the Doctor is still John Smith at this point, and Belinda isn't herself at this point either, so we're still not really getting it revealed to the Doctor, even if he does come to towards the end of the episode and know about this. But I guess they didn't care as much about this Rani reveal, because obviously the big part of this episode and the big cliffhanger for this particular episode is the return of Omega, as the Rani is trying to break apart reality to reveal the Underverse where Omega is apparently hidden. Now, it's interesting that we didn't see Omega at the end of this episode, like we did with Sutekh in the cliffhanger for The Legend of Ruby Sunday. I think that would have been a much more impactful moment to end the episode on. Instead, we just get some archived dialogue from Omega from, I think, a Big Finish audio as far as I know. But I'm assuming they're doing this for a reason. There's probably a reason they couldn't show Omega at the end of this episode because of what happened next episode. For example, maybe next episode will focus on them trying to prevent his return instead of him actually returning and them trying to banish him again. But that's just some speculation on my end. I do think it would have been more impactful if we did end it on a reveal of Omega himself. But as cool as it is to see Omega finally returning, this reveal does have me a little bit worried for the next episode, as it's already kind of overcrowded as it is with two Ranis and Conrad, and now we're adding Omega into the mix. And obviously as well, there's also the expected return of Susan next episode as well, with her showing up for the past couple of episodes. So I just think it's going to be a bit of an overcrowded finale, and I am worried about that. Speaking of Susan, this episode ends with the Doctor saying that Poppy is real, which is an interesting way to end the episode and is obviously going to have some significance next episode. Obviously, if you think about it, nobody in this episode has been created from thin air for this reality. There's no made up people that didn't exist before this wish world, which does mean that Poppy is likely a real person that's been put into this wish world. And with such a strong emphasis on this at the end of the episode, there is of course speculation that this could have something to do with Susan, and that Poppy is somehow the Doctor's real daughter and is maybe Susan's mother. But let me know what you think about that theory in the comments down below. Okay, so Wishworld is an interesting episode because it is a lot of setup similar to last year's penultimate episode, but I do think I prefer it to that because even though most of the episode is just setting up the final episode, we are still at least doing something interesting with it, with this alternate reality of Conrad's Wishworld, where we get this very stereotypical 1950s dynamic and traditional views that Conrad believes in. And so I think that is a really interesting angle for this episode to show, even if I wish we got more of that alternate reality in both this episode and the next episode, and we didn't keep cutting back to the Rani, Mrs. Flood and Conrad. But I think for that reason, I'm going to still put this fairly high. It's obviously above the Interstellar Song Contest because, like I said, that ending just really lets it down for me. I think I'm probably going to put this in a high C tier for now. It could maybe be in B tier, but like I said, I just don't think there's enough actually going on in this episode itself for it to go any higher, even if I like the alternate reality stuff. Actually, you know what? I think I will put it in B tier, but I'll put it behind the Robot Revolution. But let me know where you would rank Wishworld in the comments down below. So Wishworld ended with the Doctor falling from the balcony of the Bone Palace, and straight off the bat at the start of this episode, he is saved by Anita from Joy to the World, who opens a time door from the Time Hotel. Whilst I didn't love Anita as much as everyone else clearly did in Joy to the World, I think I mentioned that in my Joy to the World review, it is nice to see her here and is a fairly clever way to save the Doctor from that impossible situation with a nice cameo from a character that people really liked. And that's not to say I don't like Anita, I just didn't love her as much as everybody else did in Joy to the World. So it's revealed that the Wishworld keeps resetting the same day over and over again, Groundhog Day style, to make reality thinner to reveal the Underverse. I like this reveal because my favourite part of the last episode was the alternate reality of Wishworld itself, so I'm glad that we got to stay in this a little bit longer, even though we don't really do anything else with it in this episode, as the Doctor kind of brings most of the world back to normal anyway, or at least the places that this episode is set in, such as the Unit HQ. So I still do wish they could have done more with the Wishworld, like I wanted with last episode as well. Like I said, I watched this episode in the cinema, so I really appreciated the high stakes and the scale of this episode, especially when compared to Empire of Death last year, which weirdly felt kind of low-key and small, even after its high stakes opening of everybody on Earth being turned to dust. I think the battle between Unit and the Bone Beasts felt huge and very cinematic, and I particularly liked the moment with the Doctor riding the Rani's glider through the Bone Beast with his theme blasting. As dumb as it was, I just think watching that moment on the big screen just really made me feel something. And I think this episode just looked great visually overall, floppy digidouble aside, especially on the big screen. So Ruby goes to face off against Conrad using Project Indigo, which is what Martha used while working for Unit in Series 4, and it makes sense that Ruby is the one going to do this given her particular episode this season that focused on her and Conrad. Now going into this episode, I was really worried about what they were going to do with Conrad in this episode. I was thinking they might redeem him, with him giving his life to stop the Rani after he realizes he is being played by them, which I personally would have hated, as I don't think Conrad is set up as a redeemable character in this season. So while I'm glad they didn't do that, I do still find it a little bit weird that they gave Conrad a bit of a happy ending in this episode, but I appreciated that they at least showed that Ruby is annoyed by this at the end of the episode, even though she's the one that wished for it to happen in the first place. Given that we didn't see Omega at the end of last episode, and we only got archive Big Finish audio for him, I wasn't expecting to see him much in this episode, so I wasn't too annoyed when he only appears for less than 5 minutes in this episode, as that's kind of what I expected from him in this anyway. However, I don't think I'm a big fan of the Omega redesign in this episode. They've basically given him the Sutekh treatment by turning him into a big CGI monster, which I was worried that they would do again. With that being said, I think this works better than when they did it with Sutekh, but I'm not 100% sure why. Maybe it's because he doesn't appear for that long anyway, and the CGI on him is done really well as well, much like with Sutekh last year, even though I wasn't a huge fan of that redesign either. Also, I know a lot of people are annoyed with the Doctor defeating Omega by basically blasting him with a huge laser, but for me it seemed pretty obvious that he was just blasting him with a billion supernovas or whatever to send him back to the Underverse, not to kill him, because that would feel very out of character. But obviously it does feel like a bit of an underwhelming resolution to this whole Omega thing. And with that being said, it is also weird seeing the Doctor using the Vindicator as a gun, given that RTD previously said that he redesigned the sonic screwdriver in this era to make it look less like a gun. But at this point, I think RTD is just saying random stuff without even thinking about it.
One day, I think it'll be a companion called Petrol.
And then Omega just eats the Rani and Mrs. Flood escapes using the time ring, so that's that sorted, I guess. So for the most part, with everything that I've discussed so far, I mostly enjoyed this episode, but I was worried every time they kept going back to Poppy in this episode, and I was surprised by how much this episode was focused on Poppy as a character. Obviously, I knew there'd be some focus on her in this episode given the Doctor's comments at the end of Wishworld, but I didn't know the main focus of this episode would be Poppy. So like I said, every time you went back to Poppy in this episode, I was worried about where they were going with that. So when we got to the moment where Poppy disappears, as well done as that moment was with Poppy's coat getting smaller and smaller when the Doctor and Belinda were passing it back and forth, I would be lying if I said I wasn't feeling relieved in that moment. But like I said, I do think that moment was done really well, and it's one of those things where different audience members are going to notice what's going on at different times, and I think it was just so well done, especially with Millie Gibson as Ruby. Her reaction to that moment was just so great. Also, I feel like at first it seemed like the Doctor did still remember Poppy, but was keeping quiet about it for the sake of Belinda, because he winks at Ruby at one point. But But then the more it goes on, the more it seems like the Doctor has also forgotten about Poppy, which felt very weird. However, I think this is a product of them changing the ending of this episode after Ncuti decided to leave. I feel like this episode was originally going to end not long after Poppy disappeared, with the Doctor remembering Poppy and pretending he doesn't to shield Belinda from the pain, hence why he winks at Ruby. Then the episode probably would have ended with maybe 1 or 2 more scenes after that, probably the party scene we've seen an image of, likely with a cameo from Susan setting up the next season, because obviously it's kind of weird that we've been setting up Susan the past couple of episodes and then this episode has nothing to do with her at all. And then potentially with the Doctor going to find Poppy in season 3, with that somehow tying into Susan's origin or something to do with Susan. But after Ncuti decided to leave, they then needed an excuse for him to regenerate, so I think they needed to add some additional scenes with the Doctor going to bring Poppy back, which I don't think was part of the original plan for the end of this episode, which also leads to a very weird ending with Belinda being Poppy's mother, even though that clearly wasn't the case before he changed the timeline, which definitely feels weird and clearly not part of the original plan, given that Poppy is the same as Captain Poppy from Space Babies, so surely she's still out there somewhere. And it just feels like a really weird and out of left field ending for Belinda as a character, which is really unfortunate given how much she's been sidelined in the second half of this season, and she's literally shut in a box for most of this episode and then saddled with a child that she never had. And now she's also all of a sudden fine with the Doctor scanning her child's DNA, which she definitely shouldn't be fine with considering how she felt about the Doctor doing that to her in the Robot Revolution. Anyway, I don't think I heard the rumours or leaks that the 13th Doctor was going to be in this episode, but it is nice to see her in this and was a nice surprise. It feels like a nice passing of the torch between these two Doctors, given that they had David Tennant returning in between them, which honestly makes the ending of this episode feel even more annoying. And I assume they also might have done this to have the first female Doctor and first main black Doctor appear together, and because both of them have had less episodes than every other modern Doctor.
We had longer.
But I do have a feeling this maybe could have been Susan instead, which would have been nice given that we've been hinting at Susan in the past couple of episodes of this season. But like I said, I still really liked this moment and it was nice to see Jodie Whittaker return as the 13th Doctor. Obviously, we've been speculating for a while now that Ncuti Gatwa could be leaving with a surprise or at least unannounced regeneration at the end of this episode, given that he's a very sought after actor who is on the rise at the moment, and we're currently unsure on if Disney Plus are renewing in the show, and a 3rd season has yet to have been filmed. I was really hoping he wouldn't go in this episode because I've been really liking him in the past couple of seasons, especially this season, and with the 8 episode format I just don't think he's had enough time. But unfortunately this was Ncuti Gatwa's last episode of his era, so what did I think to that regeneration? Just speaking on the regeneration itself, I think it looks really good. I love the shot of the lights turning out as he's walking to the TARDIS doors, and I love the idea of him regenerating at the TARDIS doors as he's looking out into a nebula, even if I'm not a big fan of it linking to Joy to the World with Joy as a star being there, because I wasn't a big fan of that episode, especially the scene where Joy turns into a star, although it does lead to a nice final line from Ncuti as the 15th Doctor. And I love the visual of the regeneration energy going far into space as if it's a star. Even if maybe the CGI itself wasn't particularly well polished and seemed maybe a little bit unfinished because of probably how little time they had to do this scene, I still think visually as like a concept, I think it looks really nice. But I personally was expecting to cry when the 15th Doctor regenerates, as I've really come to like him, and because of how little episodes he's had, it would have been sad to see him go. But unfortunately, because of what happens next, I just couldn't feel anything in this moment. So I'd heard the rumour that Ncuti Gatwa would be regenerating into Billie Piper at the end of this episode, and when I heard it, if Ncuti Gatwa was going to be leaving, which we also weren't sure about, I didn't expect this to be true, and I honestly hoped it wouldn't be true. I heard there were a couple of alternate endings that they were debating on airing, including this one of which being that this episode would cut to black mid-regeneration, which I personally think is what they probably should have done instead of this, because it leaves it open for either someone new to be cast when they come back, or even for Ncuti to maybe continue when it comes back and when he's available again, if that is something that he obviously would want to do. This isn't anything against Billie Piper as an actor or a person. I think she's great and I think she could play the Doctor well if that is who she's going to be playing. But honestly, this choice to me just reeks of desperation, and we just did this a couple of years ago with David Tennant, who was literally just before Ncuti Gatwa's 15th Doctor. And I just think you can't just stunt cast every time you're worried that the show is about to be cancelled, especially given that I doubt they even have a plan for this, as it was probably a very last minute decision. There's been been a lot of people speculating about what this could mean. Is she the Doctor? Is she the Bad Wolf? Is she Rose? Because she obviously isn't credited as the Doctor in the credits, which a lot of people have been pointing out. And frankly, I personally think they've just done this because they aren't even sure yet either. Because like I said, I think this was just a very last minute decision of them trying to desperately make sure the show doesn't get cancelled and make sure people are still talking about it. Like I've said, I mostly enjoyed this episode, but that was up until this point with only a couple of gripes and minor issues. And this moment just really brought down the whole episode for me. I've never been one of those people to say Russell T Davies needs to leave. I've mostly been thinking that's just a very unfair thing to say. While I like seeing new talent in this show and was happy to see the amount of new guest writers this season, and would have liked to have just seen him gradually get less and less involved in the writing of the show, being more of a producer and showrunner, I'm now starting to agree with people saying that it's time for him to leave after this. We just did this a couple of years ago with David Tennant, and that made sense as it was part of an anniversary special, whereas this to me just reeks of desperation. You could argue that they've done this to celebrate this being 20 years since the revival, with its first episode being Rose, but this kind of stunt casting so soon after doing it in the 60th just doesn't sit right with me. And for Reality War, this is going to be a really difficult one for me to rank, because like I said in the review, I generally liked a lot of this episode and was having a very fun time watching it at the cinema for the first time before we got to that ending. But then we get to that ending and number one, it just kind of keeps going. The episode just keeps going on when you think it's about to end, which isn't that big of a deal, but it did feel a little bit odd and maybe a little bit drawn out, even if I still liked most of those scenes. I'm also a bit unsure on how I feel still with the stuff with Poppy in this episode, especially because it clearly didn't go to the original plan that it was meant to, but also I just wasn't expecting this episode to be so focused on Poppy as a character. But like I said, I was generally enjoying this episode for the most part until we get to that ending, and especially that ending reveal, which for me just absolutely ruins the episode and reeks of desperation, and I'm just really not a big fan of the decision in the first place. I need to be absolutely clear here, this isn't anything against Billie Piper, like I said in the review. This wasn't her decision, I'm just not a big fan of the decision in the first place, which obviously wasn't her decision. So I think if it wasn't for that moment in this episode, this would probably be like a high B, maybe even low A tier episode. But because of that ending, it just really lets it down, and it's almost making me think I want to put it in D tier, but I'm not going to do that because like I said, I enjoyed most of the episode. It's just that ending that really lets it down for me. And that scene is also shorter than the parts in the Interstellar Song Contest that I don't like. So for that reason, I think I'm going to put it in the same tier as the Interstellar Song Contest, but I'm going to put it before the Interstellar Song Contest so that it's a little bit higher up than that, because like I said, the ending of the Interstellar Song Contest, there's a big chunk of that I just don't like, and it's honestly a little bit offensive in my opinion, whereas the Reality War just has a really stupid reveal at the end that I personally hate, which is leaving me really worried for the future of the show. But like I said, the episode itself up until that point I actually had a fun time watching. So I think this is the final ranking that I'm going to do for this. Obviously I didn't plan where I was going to put any of these before making this video, so I'm not 100% certain on if this is 100% accurate in how I feel. This is more of like a gut reaction, a gut feeling. So let me know if you disagree with this or agree with this in the comments down below. I know the Interstellar Song Contest one is going to be incredibly divisive in the comments, because a lot of people love that episode and a lot of people agree with what I'm saying with the ending of that episode. And I'm sure some people probably also want me to put the Reality War even lower because a lot of people hate most of the episode, whereas I'm just mostly annoyed by that ending reveal, which some people also really like from what I've seen in the comments.